On the morning of November 10, 1871, a 30-year-old Welsh-born journalist stepped out of the African bush and into a small village on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika. He had spent 236 days cutting his way through nearly 1,000 miles of jungle, swamp, and hostile territory. 73 of the men who had started with him were dead, claimed by malaria, dysentery, crocodiles, and tribal wars. His boots had rotted off his feet weeks ago. His quinine was nearly gone. He himself had survived cerebral malaria so severe that his men had begun building a litter to carry his corpse. But none of that mattered now, because ahead of him, in a crumbling mud brick compound at the edge of the village, surrounded by a crowd of Arab slave traders and African porters, stood a frail, hollow-cheeked white man in a faded naval cap. The man was 60 years old. He had not seen another European in nearly 6 years. His teeth had fallen from his gums. Tropical ulcers had eaten through the flesh of his legs to the bone. He had been given up for dead by his family, his government, his church, and his continent. And when the journalist walked toward him, removed his pith helmet, and extended his hand, the words he spoke became the most famous greeting in the history of exploration. 4 words that masked an ocean of desperation, suffering, and obsession that neither man could have begun to explain. What happened in that village would make both men immortal. It would also set in motion a chain of events that would lead, within 30 years, to one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in human history. A genocide that consumed the lives of as many as 10 million people across the vast drainage basin of the Congo River. The story of David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley is, on its surface, a tale of rescue. But the deeper you go, the more it becomes a story about the gap between what men say they want and what they actually unleash upon the world. The primary accounts of this extraordinary collision come from the pens of both men themselves. Livingstone kept journals obsessively for more than 30 years, writing on scraps of newspaper when his ink ran dry, using berry juice when his pens broke, documenting every river crossing, every fever, every moral anguish with the dogged precision of a man who believed God was watching over his shoulder. Stanley, for his part, was a newspaperman to his core, and his dispatches, books, and private diaries provide a vivid, if carefully self-edited, account of his journey into the African interior. We also have the testimonies of James Chuma and Abdullah Susi, Livingstone's most loyal African attendants who stayed with him until the end and whose oral accounts were later recorded by Livingstone's friend Horace Waller. These are men who carried Livingstone's body over 1,000 miles of wilderness so that a foreign country could bury him beneath marble. Their perspective, so often marginalized in the telling of this story, reveals something that neither Livingstone's piety nor Stanley's bravado could fully express: the human cost of European ambition on the continent that bore its weight. To understand how a Scottish missionary and a Welsh orphan came to meet on the shore of an African lake, we must go back to the beginning, to a one-room tenement in a mill town on the banks of the River Clyde, where the story of David Livingstone started not with adventure, but with thread. Blantyre, Scotland, in the 1820s, was a place designed to crush the human spirit with mechanical efficiency. The town existed for one purpose: to feed the cotton mills that lined the river, enormous brick buildings whose churning looms could be heard from a mile away, a sound like the breathing of some vast, indifferent machine. The Livingstone family occupied a single room in a tenement block owned by the mill, a space 14 feet by 10, shared by the parents, Neil and Agnes, and their 5 children. The walls ran with condensation. The air smelled of damp wool and coal smoke. There was one window, and it looked out onto another wall. David was the second son, born on March 19, 1813, and by the age of 10, he was working in the mill. His shift began at 6 in the morning and ended at 8 at night, 14 hours of feeding cotton into a spinning jenny, the air thick with fiber dust that settled in the lungs like powdered glass. Children coughed blood by the age of 12. Many did not see 20. The noise was so constant and so loud that the child workers communicated through a system of hand signals and lip reading that they developed among themselves, a private language born of industrial deafness. But Neil Livingstone, David's father, was a man who believed that poverty was not an excuse for ignorance. He was a tea merchant, barely, a man who scraped together a living selling tea door to door across Lanarkshire while reading theology by candlelight. He was a strict Calvinist, a man of fierce moral conviction and modest practical means, and he raised his children to believe that every human being carried a divine obligation to improve the world. Agnes, David's mother, was the counterbalance. Warm where Nile was rigid, practical where Nile was philosophical, possessed of a quiet Highland resilience that allowed her to stretch a single loaf across 6 mouths without ever letting her children see her worry. Between Nile's moral fire and Agnes's endurance, the boy absorbed a peculiar combination, an unshakable belief that suffering had purpose, married to the physical toughness required to act on that belief. What set David apart from the other mill children was a single, almost perverse habit. He read, not in the evenings when exhaustion made the other children collapse onto their shared mattresses. He read during his shifts. He propped a book on the spinning jenny itself, snatching sentences between operations, training himself to read in fragments while his hands performed the mechanical work automatically. The overseers beat him for it. He went back to reading. They confiscated his books. He brought others. It was not intelligence alone that drove this behavior. Many of the mill children were intelligent. It was a specific, almost pathological refusal to accept the boundaries of his circumstances. The walls of that tenement, the roar of that mill, the gray sky above Blantyre. None of it was real to him. The real world was in the books, and the books told him there was a world beyond the Clyde. By the age of 19, Livingstone had saved enough from his mill wages to enroll in Anderson's University in Glasgow, walking the 8 miles there and back each day because he could not afford lodging. He studied medicine and theology simultaneously, not because he could not choose between them, but because he saw no distinction. To heal the body and to save the soul were, in his mind, the same work performed on different organs. It was during these years that he encountered a pamphlet that would alter the trajectory of his life and, in consequence, the fate of a continent. The pamphlet was written by Karl Gutzlaff, a German missionary working in China, and it asked a simple question: who would carry the gospel to the peoples of the world who had never heard it? Livingstone felt the question land in his chest like a physical blow. He would later describe this moment with the restrained language of a man who distrusted emotional display. He said simply that he felt a conviction that this was his work, but the conviction was total. He applied to the London Missionary Society, was accepted after a rocky start. His first trial sermon was so badly delivered that the examiner suggested he might be better suited to something other than preaching, and was assigned, after China became unavailable due to the Opium War, to a posting in southern Africa. He sailed from London on December 8, 1840, aboard the merchant ship George. He was 27 years old. He had never left the British Isles. He carried with him a medical degree, a Bible, a sextant he barely knew how to use, and a belief so profound it functioned as a kind of psychological armor. That God had placed him on this earth to open Africa to Christianity, to commerce, and to civilization. These 3 C's would become his gospel and his justification. They would also become the language that an entire generation of Europeans would use to disguise something far less noble. He arrived at the Cape Colony in March 1841 and traveled north by ox cart for nearly 700 miles to reach the mission station at Kuruman, run by the veteran missionary Robert Moffat. The landscape he traversed was unlike anything his Scottish imagination had prepared him for. The veld stretched in every direction without interruption, a vast brown ocean of grass that shimmered in the heat, punctuated by flat-topped thorn trees that cast shadows so sharp they looked painted on the earth. The sky was enormous. After the cramped gray compression of Blantyre, after the soot-stained buildings of Glasgow, the sheer scale of the African interior overwhelmed him. He wrote to a friend that the country seemed designed by God on a scale that makes a man feel both insignificant and exhilarated in the same breath. At Kuruman, Livingstone met Robert Moffat's daughter Mary. She was 21, dark-haired, quiet-mannered, and raised in Africa. She spoke Tswana before she spoke English. Livingstone was not a romantic man, His proposal, by his own account, was as practical as a bill of lading. He needed a wife to maintain a household at his mission station. Mary needed a husband who understood Africa. They married on January 2, 1845, and for a brief period, David Livingstone lived something resembling a conventional life. But the mission station could not hold him. The problem was fundamental and would define everything that followed. Livingstone was a catastrophically poor missionary. He lacked the patience for the slow, repetitive work of conversion. He could not sit in one place and teach the same catechism to the same small group of Tswana villagers week after week. He converted exactly one person in his entire career as a station missionary, a chief named Sechele, who was later expelled from the church for taking a second wife. Livingstone himself found the whole enterprise of stationary mission work suffocating. He had not traveled 7,000 miles from Blantyre to sit in a mud hut and argue about polygamy. What called to him was the horizon, always the horizon. The Tswana people told him stories of a great lake to the north that no European had ever seen. Arab traders spoke of rivers flowing through forests so dense that the sun never reached the ground. The interior of southern Africa was, in 1849, essentially a blank space on European maps, thousands upon thousands of square miles marked with nothing but the cartographer's confession of ignorance. And there was something else, something that would become the animating fury of Livingstone's life: the slave trade. Since the 16th century, Arab and Portuguese traders had been extracting human beings from the African interior, marching them in chains to the coast, where they were loaded onto dhows and shipped to Zanzibar, to the Arabian Peninsula, to the plantations of Brazil. By the mid-19th century, the East African slave trade was consuming an estimated 80,000 lives per year. The routes ran through the very territories Livingstone was beginning to explore, and the evidence of the traffic was everywhere. Abandoned villages, skeletal remains along the trails, the haunted eyes of people who had watched their families disappear. Livingstone had inherited his father's moral absolutism, and the slave trade activated it like a match-touching powder. He became convinced, with a certainty that burned like fever, that the only way to end the trade was to open Africa to what he called legitimate commerce. If European traders could be persuaded to buy African goods, cotton, ivory, copper, palm oil, then the economic incentive for selling human beings would wither. Christianity would follow commerce, and civilization would follow Christianity. It was a theory of elegant simplicity. It was also a theory that would be used within a generation to justify the very colonization that would enslave Africans under a different name. But in 1849, David Livingstone believed in it absolutely, and that belief gave him permission to do what he had always wanted to do anyway: leave the mission station and walk into the unknown. He began to travel, first in short bursts, a few weeks, a few months, then for longer. Mary went with him at first, pregnant and nursing, dragging their small children across the Kalahari Desert in an ox cart. Their daughter Elizabeth was born during one of these expeditions and died 6 weeks later. Mary contracted a partial paralysis of the face that left one side drooping for the rest of her life. The children were malnourished, sunburned, and terrified. Livingstone recorded these facts in his journal with the same clinical precision he applied to his observations of geography and wildlife. He noted Elizabeth's death in 3 sentences. He devoted a full page to the description of a new species of beetle discovered the same week. This was not cruelty. Or perhaps it was a cruelty so deeply embedded in the man's psychological architecture that he could not see it as such. Livingstone genuinely believed that his mission was of such cosmic importance that personal suffering, his own or his family's, was a trivial price. God had called him to open Africa. His wife and children were part of the sacrifice that calling demanded. He would later send Mary and the children back to Scotland, where they lived in near poverty while he continued his explorations. Mary would not see her husband for years at a stretch. The children grew up effectively fatherless. Robert, the eldest, would later descend into alcoholism. The family's letters to Livingstone, preserved in the archives of the National Library of Scotland, trace a devastating arc from longing to resignation to barely concealed anger. Mary wrote to him in 1852, "I must again plead with you to think of your children. They are growing up without you, and they feel it keenly." Livingstone received the letter 6 months after it was sent. He noted its arrival in his journal and continued planning his next expedition. In 1852, he embarked on what would become the journey that made him the most famous explorer in the world. His stated objective was to find a navigable river route from the interior of southern Africa to either the Atlantic or Indian Ocean coast, a commercial highway that would allow legitimate trade to penetrate the continent and undermine the slave economy. It was an audacious goal. No European had ever crossed the African continent. The interior was unmapped, populated by peoples with whom Livingstone had no common language, and riddled with diseases for which European medicine had no answer. He set out from Linyanti, the capital of the Makololo people in what is now Botswana, with 27 African companions. He carried almost nothing: a few instruments, a small stock of medicines, some glass beads and cloth for trade, a magic lantern for impressing chiefs, and his rifle. He wore the same clothes for months at a time. He had no tent. He slept on the ground, often in rain that turned the earth to red mud beneath him. The journey took him first northwest, following the Zambezi River and its tributaries through landscapes of staggering diversity, from the dry thornveld of the south to the vast floodplains of the Barotse, where the rivers spread into a shallow inland sea during the rainy season, and the Makololo people poled their canoes through water meadows thick with lotus and water lily. Then into dense Mapane forest, where tsetse flies swarmed in clouds so thick that cattle died within days of being bitten. Then through the fever country, where the air itself seemed poisonous, heavy, wet, and smelling of rot. Livingstone contracted malaria repeatedly. His journal entries from this period are written in a hand that visibly deteriorates, firm and precise in the morning, shaky and cramped by evening as the fever took hold, sometimes trailing off mid-sentence. He reached the Atlantic coast at Luanda in Portuguese Angola on May 31, 1854. He had been traveling for 6 months. He was emaciated, fevered, and temporarily blind in one eye from a branch that had struck him in dense forest. The Portuguese governor took him in, fed him, offered him passage on a ship back to England. Livingstone refused. He had promised the Makololo men who had accompanied him that he would return them to their homes, and he had not yet found his navigable highway. He turned around. He walked back across the entire width of southern Africa, this time heading east toward the Indian Ocean. And on November 16, 1855, following the sound of a roar that could be heard 5 miles away, he arrived at the edge of a chasm so vast that the spray rising from its depths created a permanent rainbow visible from 10 miles distant. The Makololo called it Mosi Oatunya, the smoke that thunders. It was a curtain of water over a mile wide, plunging 350 feet into a basalt gorge, so narrow that the entire volume of the Zambezi was compressed into a channel barely 100 yards across. The noise was beyond anything Livingstone had experienced. Not a sound so much as a physical force, a vibration that entered the chest and made the ribs hum. The spray soaked him from 600 yards away. He crawled to the edge on his stomach and peered over into a boiling white chaos that seemed to have no bottom. He named it Victoria Falls, after his queen. The Makololo, who had known it for generations, likely found this presumption puzzling. But the naming was not really about geography. It was about possession, the European ritual of planting a flag in someone else's wonder and declaring it discovered. Livingstone was aware of this tension at some level. He wrote in his journal that the falls were the most wonderful sight I had witnessed in Africa, but he also noted that the Makololo were not in the least impressed by my astonishment, as they had seen it many times. It is a rare moment of self-awareness in a man who generally assumed that his presence in a landscape constituted its introduction to history. He reached the Indian Ocean coast at Quelimane in Mozambique on May 20, 1856. He had crossed Africa from west to east, the first European to do so. The journey had taken 4 years. He had mapped thousands of miles of previously uncharted territory, recorded dozens of new species, documented the slave trade routes with devastating precision, and nearly died of malaria more than 30 times. His African companions had carried him when he could not walk, fed him when he could not feed himself, and navigated rivers he could not have found alone. When he returned to England in December 1856, he was met with a reception that would be difficult to exaggerate. He was, overnight, the most celebrated man in Britain. Crowds lined the streets when his carriage passed. The Royal Geographical Society awarded him their gold medal. He had an audience with Queen Victoria. His book, Missionary Travels, sold 70,000 copies, a staggering number for the era, and made him wealthy for the first and only time in his life. He was invited to speak at universities, churches, civic halls, and private salons. The Times declared him the greatest living explorer. Punch magazine caricatured him as a lion, a reference to an encounter early in his career when a lion had attacked him, crushing his left arm so badly that it never fully healed, leaving him unable to raise a rifle to his left shoulder for the rest of his life. But something had changed in Livingstone during that transcontinental crossing. Something had shifted at a depth that even he may not have fully understood. He had spent 4 years walking through the interior of a continent that was, to him, the most beautiful and terrible place on earth. He had seen landscapes that no European eye had witnessed. He had felt the isolation, the grandeur, the freedom of moving through a world unmarked by the constraints and hypocrisies of Victorian society. And he had seen the slave trade, not as an abstraction in a parliamentary report, but as a physical reality. Chains, whips, bodies left beside the trail because they could no longer walk, children separated from mothers, the sound of weeping carried on the wind across the empty bush. England, by contrast, felt small. The drawing rooms felt suffocating. The questions at lectures felt trivial. People wanted to hear about lions and waterfalls. They did not want to hear about the slave trade, not really. Not in the specific visceral detail that haunted Livingstone's sleep. They wanted the romance of Africa, not its agony. Mary was there, in England, with the children he barely recognized. Robert was now a sullen teenager who regarded his father with a mixture of awe and resentment. The younger children were strangers to him. Mary had aged beyond her years. The partial facial paralysis, the years of poverty and loneliness, the death of their daughter, all of it was written on her face. Livingstone saw it. He recorded it. And within 18 months, he was planning to leave again. His second major expedition, launched in 1858, was a government-sponsored affair, the Zambezi Expedition, funded by the British Foreign Office with the explicit goal of opening the Zambezi River to steamboat commerce. It was the realization of Livingstone's dream, legitimate commerce penetrating the African interior, displacing the slave trade, bringing civilization in its wake. The government gave him a steam launch, a crew of Europeans, and a budget. It was a disaster. The Zambezi, which Livingstone had navigated during the dry season, proved completely unnavigable during the wet season, choked with rapids and sandbars that the steam launch could not pass. Livingstone had either failed to notice these obstacles during his crossing or had deliberately omitted them from his reports. His European crew members, unused to his autocratic leadership style and his indifference to their physical comfort, began to despise him. The expedition's geologist called him a damned sultan. The naval officer assigned to pilot the launch wrote home that Livingstone was the most difficult man I have ever served under. And then Mary came. She had crossed the ocean to join him, unable to bear another separation. She arrived at the mouth of the Zambezi in January 1862, weakened by the voyage and already showing symptoms of the fever that would kill her. On April 27th, 3 months after her arrival, Mary Livingstone died of malaria at the age of 41. She was buried beneath a baobab tree on the banks of the Zambezi, far from Scotland, far from her children, in a country she had loved and that had taken everything from her. Livingstone stood beside the grave and wept. It is one of the only recorded instances of his crying. His journal entry for that day is brief, almost brutally so, as if he could not trust himself to write more than a few lines without losing the composure that had become the scaffolding of his entire identity. "It is the first heavy stroke I have suffered," he wrote, "and quite takes away my strength, I wept over her who well deserved many tears. I loved her when I married her, and the longer I lived with her, I loved her the more." Then he closed the journal, and he went back to work. The Zambezi expedition was officially recalled in 1864. Livingstone returned to England under a cloud, not disgraced exactly, but diminished. The government had spent a great deal of money and received very little in return. The navigable highway to the interior did not exist. The steam launch sat rusting on a sandbar. Several European members of the expedition had died, and Mary was buried under a baobab tree 6,000 miles from home. But Livingstone was not finished. He was, in fact, only beginning the descent that would consume the final decade of his life and carry him into the interior of Africa one last time, a journey from which he would never return. In the quiet of his London lodgings, with the rain streaking the windows and the sounds of carriages passing on the street below, David Livingstone was already planning his next expedition. He told himself it was about the slave trade. He told himself it was about the source of the Nile, the great geographical prize that had obsessed European explorers for decades. He told the Royal Geographical Society that he could settle the question once and for all. But something else was driving him now, something darker and more personal than scientific curiosity or moral conviction. Africa had become the only place where David Livingstone felt fully alive. The mills of Blantyre, the drawing rooms of London, the obligations of fatherhood and marriage. All of it had fallen away, layer by layer, until only the walking remained. The endless walking through a landscape that asked nothing of him, except that he keep moving. He was 52 years old. His left arm was permanently damaged. His body was riddled with the accumulated damage of decades of tropical disease. His teeth were loosening in his gums, and he was about to walk into the heart of Africa and vanish from the face of the earth. Livingstone departed from England for the last time in August 1865. He sailed to Bombay, then to Zanzibar, the island that served as the gateway to the East African interior and, not coincidentally, as the greatest slave market on the Indian Ocean. The Sultan's palace overlooked a harbor choked with dhows, and the air in the stone town carried the sweet, nauseating smell of cloves mixed with something else, the smell of human misery concentrated into a few square blocks of holding pens and auction platforms where men, women, and children stood naked while buyers inspected their teeth and the calluses on their hands. Livingstone walked through the slave market on the day he arrived. He had seen the trade in the interior, the trails, the abandoned villages, the skeletal remains. But the market at Zanzibar was the machine's output, the place where the raw material of human suffering was converted into currency. He estimated that 300 people were sold in the market that day. He watched a woman with an infant at her breast sold to an Arab merchant who showed no interest in the child. He watched a boy of perhaps 10 stand perfectly still while a buyer forced open his mouth and examined his tongue. He recorded these observations in his journal with the clinical precision he brought to all things. But the handwriting in these passages is different, pressed harder into the page, as if the pen were being driven by a force the hand could barely contain. He assembled his expedition on the mainland at Mikindani, in what is now southern Tanzania. The party was large by his standards, roughly 60 men, including a core group of African veterans from previous journeys, a contingent of sepoys from British India who proved almost immediately useless in the African bush, and a group of porters recruited from the Yao people, several of whom turned out to be involved in the very slave trade Livingstone had come to document. The expedition was undermined before it began. Within weeks, the sepoys had deserted. Several Yao porters stole supplies and vanished. Others, Livingstone would later discover, had been reporting his movements to slave traders operating in the region. But the most devastating loss occurred early and quietly. The expedition's pack animals, donkeys and mules brought from India, began dying almost as soon as they entered the bush. Tsetse flies. The parasites they carried destroyed the animals' blood cells over the course of weeks, and one by one, the animals staggered, collapsed, and died with their eyes glazed and their breathing shallow. With them went the bulk of Livingstone's medicines, instruments, and trade goods. He was forced to redistribute the remaining supplies among the porters, who were already overburdened and growing mutinous. Livingstone pressed on. he always pressed on. It was the defining characteristic of his personality and the source of both his greatness and his destruction. He marched his diminished party west from the coast, climbing from the humid lowlands into the cooler plateau country, moving toward the vast lake system that occupies the Great Rift Valley, like water pooled in a crack in the Earth's surface. His objective was Lake Tanganyika, which he believed might be connected to the source of the Nile through a network of rivers and lakes that no European had yet traced. The great geographical question of the age, where does the Nile begin, had consumed explorers for more than a decade. Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke had reached Lake Tanganyika in 1858. Speke had then visited Lake Victoria and declared it the Nile's source. Burton violently disagreed. The argument had become the most public and bitter scientific controversy in Victorian Britain, culminating in a debate at the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1864, during which Speke, scheduled to argue his case against Burton that very afternoon, was found dead in a field with a shotgun wound to his chest. The coroner called it a hunting accident. Almost no one believed it. Livingstone intended to settle the question. He believed, incorrectly as it would turn out, that the Nile's source lay farther south than either Burton or Speke had ventured, somewhere in the tangle of rivers and swamps between Lake Tanganyika and Lake Bangweulu. He would spend the next 6 years searching for it, walking in vast, agonizing loops through some of the most difficult terrain on the planet, growing weaker with each passing season, his body consuming itself as the diseases accumulated and the food grew scarce. The first 2 years were hard but productive. He reached Lake Tanganyika in early 1867 and began mapping its southern end, then struck south toward Lake Bangweulu and the country of the Bemba people. He traveled through landscapes that shifted with disorienting speed. Dense Miambo woodland giving way to open grassland, grassland giving way to swamp, swamp giving way to rivers so wide and slow they seemed more like lakes in motion. The wildlife was staggering in its abundance. Herds of elephant moved through the bush in columns that took half an hour to pass. Hippopotami crowded the rivers so densely that their backs formed stepping stones across the shallows. At night, the sound of lions was constant, not the single dramatic roar of European imagination, but a deep, rolling grunt repeated over and over, felt in the ground as much as heard in the air. But the slave trade was everywhere too, woven into the landscape like a dark thread through bright cloth. Livingstone encountered caravan after caravan of enslaved people being marched toward the coast. The caravans moved in long files, the captives linked by wooden yokes clamped around their necks, forked branches that locked two people together so that neither could run without dragging the other. Those who collapsed were left where they fell or killed with a single blow to spare the traders the burden of carrying them. Livingstone recorded one encounter in language that stripped away every layer of Victorian restraint. "We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. The people of the country explained that she had been unable to keep up with the other slaves in the gang and her master had determined that she should not become the property of anyone else. We saw others tied up in a similar manner and one lying in the path shot or stabbed for she was in a pool of blood. The explanation we got invariably was that the weights were thrown off to prevent slaves from escaping." He wrote these passages not as editorial commentary, but as evidence, accumulating a body of testimony that he intended to present to the British government upon his return. Each observation was dated, located, and described with the specificity of a man building a legal case. He was, in his own mind, a prosecutor assembling the indictment that would finally force Britain to act against the East African slave trade. The fact that he was simultaneously losing his ability to act, that his body was failing, his supplies were gone, and his expedition was disintegrating around him did not alter his sense of purpose. If anything, the physical suffering reinforced it. He was a Calvinist to his marrow. Suffering was evidence that the work mattered. By 1869, the expedition had effectively ceased to function as an organized enterprise. Most of the original porters had deserted or been dismissed. Livingstone's core group was reduced to a handful of loyal men, Chuma, Susie, and a few others who stayed not because they were paid, which they were not, but because their loyalty to the old man had become a kind of faith in itself. His supply lines had collapsed entirely. The medicines, instruments, and trade goods he had arranged to have sent from Zanzibar were repeatedly stolen, most notoriously by a group of porters who looted an entire supply shipment and sold the contents to slave traders. Livingstone did not learn of this theft for months, and when he did, the realization was devastating. He was now almost entirely dependent on the hospitality of Arab slave traders for food and shelter, the very men whose enterprise he had sworn to destroy. This was the central agonizing paradox of Livingstone's final years. The man who had dedicated his life to ending the slave trade found himself living among slavers, eating their food, sleeping under their roofs, and depending on their goodwill for survival. The most prominent of these was a trader named Tipu Tip, born Hamid bin Muhammad al-Murjabi, a half-Arab, half-African merchant prince who controlled a vast commercial empire in the eastern Congo. Tipu Tip was charming, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. He commanded thousands of armed men and dealt in ivory and human beings with equal commercial indifference. He treated Livingstone with elaborate courtesy, providing him with food, shelter, and porters on multiple occasions. Livingstone accepted these gifts because the alternative was starvation. But his journal entries from this period reveal a man at war with himself, grateful for the kindness, disgusted by its source, aware that his dependence on slavers was corroding the moral authority that was the only weapon he possessed. "I am heartsick at the misery I witness," he wrote in January 1870, "but I am also dependent on those who cause it. The Lord knows my heart. I pray that He also understands my weakness." His body was in a state of cascading failure. The accumulated damage of 3 decades of tropical disease had eroded every system. Malaria recurred with increasing frequency and severity, no longer the periodic bouts that could be managed with quinine, but a chronic grinding assault that left him fevered, delirious, and unable to walk for days at a time. Dysentery ravaged his digestive system until he could barely absorb food. His feet were a horror. The flesh cracked and bleeding, swollen with parasitic infections, each step a negotiation with pain. The internal bleeding that would eventually kill him had almost certainly begun by this point, though he did not know its cause. He attributed the blood in his stool to the dysentery. It was, in all likelihood, a sign of something far worse. And yet, he kept walking. Through 1870 and into 1871, Livingstone traced the Lualaba River, which he believed was the Upper Nile, but which was in fact the Upper Congo, deeper into the interior, moving through country that was being systematically destroyed by the slave trade. The villages he passed through told a story of escalating devastation. Some were thriving communities of several thousand people, their fields planted with cassava and millet, their markets noisy with commerce. Others were burned-out shells, empty granaries, collapsed huts, human bones scattered in the ash. The pattern was always the same. Slave traders would arrive, demand captives, and if the demand was refused, they would attack. The survivors would flee into the bush, abandoning their crops. Famine would follow. The weakened survivors would then be captured in the next raid. It was a machine of annihilation that fed on its own output, and Livingstone documented it with the methodical horror of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that would not be believed without evidence. On July 15, 1871, he witnessed the event that would haunt the remainder of his life and become the centerpiece of his campaign against the slave trade. He was in the town of Nyangwe, on the banks of the Lualaba, a prosperous market town where more than 1,000 people, most of them women, had gathered to trade fish, cassava, and palm oil. The market occupied an open area near the riverbank, and the atmosphere was, by Livingstone's account, lively and ordinary. Women sat behind their small displays of goods. Children ran between the stalls. The sound of haggling and laughter carried across the water. Then, the shooting began. A group of Arab slavers under the command of a trader named Tagamoyo opened fire on the market with muskets. The shooting was indiscriminate, aimed into the densest concentration of people with no attempt to distinguish combatants from traders, adults from children, men from women. The market erupted into chaos. People ran in every direction. Hundreds plunged into the river, trying to swim to the far bank. The slavers followed them to the water's edge and continued firing into the river. Canoes overturned. People who could not swim thrashed in the current and went under. Those who reached the far bank were met by another group of slavers who had crossed upstream. Livingstone stood on the bank and watched. He could not stop it. He had no weapons, no men, no authority. He was a 60-year-old man with rotting teeth and ulcerated legs, standing in the middle of a massacre with nothing but a journal and a pencil. He estimated that between 300 and 400 people were killed in the space of an hour. The river ran red for the rest of the afternoon. Bodies drifted downstream for days. The market, one of the largest and oldest in the region, never reopened. His journal entry for that day is the longest and most emotionally raw passage in the entire 30-year archive of his writing. The clinical precision is still there. He records the time, the sequence of events, the positions of the shooters, the direction of the current, but it is fractured by passages of anguish that break through the documentary framework like water through a cracked dam. "It gave me the impression of being in hell," he wrote. "I cannot stay here, yet where can I go? All is slave trade and murder." The Nyangwe massacre broke something in Livingstone, not his resolve, which was beyond breaking, but his faith in the possibility of witness as action. He had spent decades believing that if he could document the slave trade with sufficient precision, the civilized world would be compelled to act. Nyangwe showed him the limits of that belief. He had documented, he had witnessed, and 300 people were dead in a river while he stood on the bank holding a pencil. He turned east from Nyangwe, walking toward Lake Tanganyika in a state of physical and psychological collapse. His feet were so damaged that each step left bloody prints on the trail. His men carried him across rivers because he could no longer trust his legs in the current. The fever was almost continuous now. His journal entries dwindled to a few lines per day, sometimes just a compass bearing and a note about the weather. The handwriting, once precise and small, designed to conserve the precious paper, became large and wavering, the letters drifting apart as if the hand that formed them was losing its grip on the pen. It was during this period, the lowest point of Livingstone's life, when he was sick, starving, grieving, and walking through a landscape saturated with the evidence of human cruelty, that a 30-year-old journalist was cutting his way toward him from the coast, driven by ambitions so different from Livingstone's that the collision of these two men would produce one of the most psychologically complex encounters in the history of exploration. To understand Henry Morton Stanley, we must first understand that the name itself was a fiction. He was born John Rowlands in Denbigh, Wales, on January 28, 1841, and his childhood was a study in abandonment so systematic that it seemed almost designed to produce either a monster or a man of extraordinary compensating will. It produced both. His mother, Elizabeth Parry, was 18 and unmarried when she gave birth to him. His father was almost certainly a man named John Rowlands, a local drunkard who died when the boy was 2. Elizabeth showed no interest in raising her son. She left him with his maternal grandfather, who cared for the boy until the grandfather's death when John was 5. The family then passed the child around like an unwanted parcel, from one relative to another, each accepting him with less enthusiasm than the last, until finally, at the age of 6, he was deposited at the St. Asaph Union Workhouse. Victorian workhouses were not orphanages in any modern sense of the word. They were institutions designed to make poverty so unpleasant that the poor would do anything to escape it. St. Asaph was run by a man named James Francis, a former schoolmaster whose pedagogical method relied primarily on the birch rod and the fist. The children slept on straw mattresses in unheated dormitories. They ate porridge that was often spoiled and bread that was frequently moldy. They worked, picking oakum, breaking stones, scrubbing floors, and they were beaten for infractions both real and invented. Francis beat the children with a regularity that suggests not discipline, but compulsion. Stanley would later describe the workhouse years in his autobiography with a controlled fury that even decades of self-reinvention could not fully disguise. "I learned that the weak were the prey of the strong," he wrote, "and I resolved never to be weak." He remained in the workhouse for 9 years. 9 years of institutional cruelty, of watching smaller children terrorized, of receiving no letters and no visits from the mother who lived less than 20 miles away. The psychological wound this inflicted was not a wound that healed, it was a wound that hardened. By the time Stanley left St. Asaph at the age of 15, he had developed the emotional architecture that would define him for the rest of his life. A ferocious need for recognition, an inability to trust affection, a gift for self-invention so complete that the real self became almost unreachable, and a capacity for physical and emotional endurance that bordered on the inhuman. He escaped the workhouse, physically overpowering Francis in a final confrontation that Stanley described with evident satisfaction, and spent the next 2 years working odd jobs across Wales and Liverpool, sleeping in doorways and on docks, stealing food when he had to, lying about his age and background to anyone who asked. In 1859, at the age of 18, he signed on as a cabin boy aboard a merchant vessel bound for New Orleans. New Orleans in 1859 was a city balanced on the edge of the abyss. The slave markets were still operating. The cotton economy was at its peak, and the war that would consume 600,000 lives was less than 2 years away. John Rowlands stepped off the ship and into a world that was, in its own way, as brutal and hierarchical as the workhouse, but vastly larger and full of opportunity for a young man who had nothing to lose and no identity he wished to keep. He found work with a cotton broker named Henry Hope Stanley, a middle-aged merchant who, by the young man's account, took an almost paternal interest in the ragged Welsh immigrant. What happened next is unclear, because Stanley spent the rest of his life constructing a mythology around this relationship. He claimed that the elder Stanley formally adopted him, gave him his name, and provided him with the stable home he had never known. The historical evidence suggests something more complicated, that the adoption was informal at best, that the elder Stanley's interest may have been less paternal than the younger man wished to believe, and that when the elder Stanley died in 1861, he left the young man nothing. No inheritance, no legal claim to the name he had already begun using. But the name stuck. John Rowlands was dead. Henry Morton Stanley had taken his place, and this act of self-invention, this wholesale erasure of a Welsh workhouse boy and his replacement by an American gentleman of means, was not a one-time transformation. It was an ongoing project, a daily performance that required constant maintenance, constant vigilance against the possibility that someone might discover the truth beneath the fiction. Stanley's entire adult life was shaped by this fear. Every achievement was, in part, an attempt to build a wall of accomplishment so high and so solid that no one could see over it to the workhouse on the other side. The American Civil War gave him his first opportunity to prove himself. He enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1862, not out of conviction, but because he was living in Arkansas and conscription was not optional. He fought at the Battle of Shiloh, one of the bloodiest engagements of the war, where 23,000 men fell in 2 days of fighting across fields and orchards that were reduced to landscapes of shattered wood and human remains. Stanley was captured on the second day and sent to a Union prison camp at Camp Douglas, outside Chicago. The camp was a death factory. Prisoners died of dysentery, pneumonia, and starvation at a rate that made the workhouse look humane. Stanley survived by doing what he had always done. He switched sides. He enlisted in the Union Army to secure his release, served for a few weeks, was discharged due to illness, and spent the remainder of the war drifting between the Union Navy and the Merchant Marine, accumulating experiences and identities with the fluidity of a man for whom loyalty was a survival strategy, not a moral principle. After the war, he discovered journalism. It was the perfect profession for a man whose greatest talent was the construction of compelling narrative from raw experience. He was hired by the Missouri Democrat, then moved to the New York Herald, the most sensational and widely read newspaper in America. The Herald was owned by James Gordon Bennett Jr., a man whose editorial philosophy could be summarized in 4 words: find the story first. Bennett sent reporters to wars, disasters, and expeditions with instructions to produce copy that was vivid, dramatic, and, when necessary, embellished to the point of fiction. It was a newspaper that valued sensation over accuracy, spectacle over nuance, and it found in Stanley the perfect instrument for its purposes. Stanley covered the Indian Wars on the American plains, the British military expedition to Abyssinia, and the opening of the Suez Canal. He was a brilliant writer, fast, vivid, and utterly unencumbered by the scruples that slowed more cautious journalists. His dispatches crackled with energy and detail. He had an eye for the telling physical observation, the dramatic set piece, the moment of human extremity that made readers feel they were standing beside him in the dust and the noise. He also had a tendency to place himself at the center of every story he told and to resolve ambiguities in his own favor. He was not, by the standards of any era, a reliable narrator, but he was an unforgettable one. In October 1869, James Gordon Bennett Jr. summoned Stanley to the Grand Hotel in Paris and gave him the assignment that would define his life. "I want you to find Livingstone," Bennett said. Or rather, that is what Stanley claimed Bennett said. The conversation was recorded only by Stanley, and Stanley never let facts interfere with a good scene. The instruction, whether delivered in those precise words or not, was clear enough. David Livingstone had not been heard from in nearly 3 years. The last communication from the interior, a handful of letters carried by Arab traders to the coast and then forwarded to England, had arrived in 1868 and described a man in desperate circumstances, sick and lost and running out of supplies. Since then, nothing. The British government had expressed concern but had done little. The Royal Geographical Society had sent a search expedition under the command of a young naval officer named Edward Young, but Young had turned back at Lake Nyasa without penetrating to Livingstone's last known position. Bennett wanted the story, not the rescue. He did not care whether Livingstone was alive or dead. He wanted the story of finding him, the spectacle of an American journalist succeeding where the British establishment had failed. It was a stunt, a circulation play, a piece of journalistic theater designed to sell newspapers. Bennett gave Stanley what amounted to an unlimited budget and a simple directive: find Livingstone and bring back the story. Stanley prepared with a methodical intensity that revealed the military mind beneath the journalist's facade. He spent months in Zanzibar, assembling the largest and best-equipped expedition that had ever been launched into the East African interior. He recruited nearly 200 porters and guards. He purchased 6 tons of supplies: cloth, beads, wire, ammunition, food, medicines, tents, boats. He hired armed escorts from the Zanzibari merchant class. He organized the expedition into 5 separate caravans, each with its own leader and supply chain, so that the loss of one would not cripple the whole. The total cost was the equivalent of roughly $500,000 in modern currency. Bennett paid it without blinking. On March 21, 1871, Stanley's expedition departed from Bagamoyo on the coast of present-day Tanzania and marched west into the interior. What followed was 236 days of sustained hardship that would have destroyed a man of lesser will, and very nearly destroyed Stanley. The route from Bagamoyo to Ujiji, the Arab trading settlement on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, where Livingstone was last rumored to be, stretched roughly 750 miles as the crow flies. But no one walked it as the crow flew. The trail wound through a succession of environments that seemed designed by some malevolent intelligence to test every possible mode of human endurance, one after another, with no respite between them. The first obstacle was the coastal plain, a belt of low, swampy ground, roughly 60 miles wide, where the air hung heavy with moisture and the temperature rarely dropped below 90 degrees. The vegetation was dense and tangled, a thicket of scrub and palm and thorn that had to be cut through yard by yard. The ground underfoot was black mud that sucked at boots and bare feet alike, releasing with each step a smell of vegetable decay so thick it coated the back of the throat. Mosquitoes arrived at dusk in clouds so dense they darkened the air, and with them came the plasmodium parasites that would, within days, begin their patient work of colonizing the red blood cells of every man in the expedition. Stanley drove his men hard. He rose before dawn, roused the camp with shouts and threats, and marched until the heat of midday forced even him to stop. He allowed a 2-hour rest, then marched again until dark. He kept meticulous records of distance covered, compass bearings taken, supplies consumed. He inspected the loads carried by each porter and punished those he caught discarding weight to ease their burden. He was not cruel in the manner of the slavers, He did not use the lash casually or punish without reason, but he was relentless in a way that left no room for the human frailties of exhaustion, fear, or homesickness. The porters were instruments of the mission. The mission was finding Livingstone. Everything else was noise. Within the first 2 weeks, the expedition encountered its first major crisis. Malaria swept through the column like a brush fire. Men who had been marching strongly at dawn were shivering and delirious by noon, their temperatures spiking to 105 degrees, their skin burning to the touch while they complained of cold so intense they begged for blankets in the equatorial heat. Stanley distributed quinine. He had brought a substantial supply, having studied the accounts of previous expeditions with the attention of a general planning a campaign. But the doses were insufficient for the scale of the outbreak. Men began to die. 2 porters on the 3rd day, another on the 5th, a guard on the 7th. Stanley recorded each death with the same notation, name, cause, date, and kept marching. He himself was not spared. The first attack of fever hit him on the 9th day, arriving with the classic signature of cerebral malaria. A sudden, violent headache that felt like a metal band tightening around the skull, followed by a wave of nausea so powerful that he could not stand, followed by a cold so deep that his teeth chattered and his fingers turned blue. Then the heat came, a burning from inside that made him feel as though his blood had been replaced with molten lead. He lay in his tent through the worst of it, dosing himself with quinine and brandy, emerging the next morning gray-faced and 20 pounds lighter to resume the march. He would suffer more than 20 bouts of malaria during the expedition. Each one left him weaker than the last, peeling away layers of physical reserve like bark from a rotting tree. Beyond the coastal swamps, the trail climbed into the Usagra Highlands, a region of steep rocky hills covered in dense forest that offered relief from the heat but introduced new torments. The paths were narrow and precipitous, winding along ridges where a single misstep could send a man and his 60-pound load tumbling into a ravine. Rain fell daily in the highlands, not the gentle rain of temperate latitudes, but vertical sheets of water that arrived without warning and transformed every trail into a stream and every stream into a torrent. The porters' loads, wrapped in canvas and oilcloth, became sodden despite every precaution. Cloth and beads, the primary currency for purchasing food and passage through tribal territories, began to rot. Ammunition corroded in its boxes, paper dissolved. Stanley's own journal required constant vigilance. He wrapped it in rubber sheeting and carried it against his body to keep it dry, and even so, the pages swelled and warped with moisture, the ink bleeding into halos around each word. The highlands also brought them into contact with the Wagogo people, whose territory straddled the main caravan route to the interior. The Wagogo had long since learned to extract tribute, hongo, from every caravan that passed through their land, and their demands were non-negotiable. Each chief along the route required payment in cloth, beads, or wire before granting passage. The payments were substantial, sometimes amounting to a quarter of a caravan's remaining trade goods, and they were accompanied by elaborate negotiations that could consume days while the expedition sat idle, burning through food supplies and losing momentum. Stanley chafed at these delays with a fury he could barely contain. He was a man on a deadline, though the deadline was self-imposed. He had no way of knowing whether Livingstone was alive or dead, and every day of delay increased the probability that the story he was chasing would end before he reached it. His negotiations with the Wagogo chiefs reveal the fundamental difference between Stanley and Livingstone in their approach to Africa. Livingstone, for all his faults, treated African leaders as sovereigns whose authority was legitimate and whose customs deserved respect, even when those customs frustrated his purposes. He sat through lengthy councils, accepted gifts of beer and food, explained his mission with patience, and generally regarded the African political landscape as a complex reality to be navigated rather than an obstacle to be overcome. Stanley regarded it as an obstacle to be overcome. He paid the hongo because he had to, but he paid it with unconcealed resentment, and his journal entries about the Wagogo drip with a contempt that reveals the limits of his capacity for cross-cultural understanding. "These people are the most avaricious, grasping set of savages I have yet encountered," he wrote after a particularly expensive negotiation. "They regard the passing stranger as a sheep to be sheared, and they shear him with the efficiency of professional thieves." The language tells us less about the Wagogo than about Stanley. The man who had spent his childhood as the powerless victim of institutional authority could not bear to be at the mercy of anyone else's power structure. Every demand for tribute, every enforced delay, every moment of dependence on another person's goodwill was a repetition of the workhouse, a reminder that the world could reduce you to nothing if you let it. Stanley's response was to refuse to let it. He marched faster, negotiated harder, paid less when he could, and left each encounter convinced that the only reliable currency in Africa, or anywhere else, was strength. Beyond Wagogo territory, the expedition entered the Ugogo Plateau, a vast expanse of dry, flat country covered in thorn scrub and baked by a sun that hammered the earth with such intensity that the air above the trail shimmered like water. Water sources were scarce and unpredictable. The expedition carried water in gourds and skins, but the supply was never adequate for 200 men marching through temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees. Thirst became the dominant experience, a thirst so pervasive that it colonized every thought, reducing the world to a single consuming need. Men's lips cracked and bled, their tongues swelled. Some began drinking from puddles that were contaminated with animal waste, and within days, the dysentery that had been a background nuisance became an epidemic. Dysentery in the African interior was not the manageable intestinal complaint of temperate latitudes. It was a disease that could kill in a matter of days, draining the body of fluid through bloody diarrhea so severe that men could not stand, could not walk, could not hold a cup. The treatment, rest, clean water, careful diet, was unavailable on a forced march through waterless country. Men died on the trail, their bodies left where they fell because the expedition could not afford the time or the manpower to bury them. Stanley recorded 19 deaths from dysentery in the crossing of the Ugogo Plateau alone. He did not record the names of the men who died. They were, in his accounting, units of capability lost from the expedition's operational strength. Regrettable, but not sufficient cause to alter the pace of march. It was here, in the dry heart of Ugogo, that Stanley first began to confront the psychological cost of the journey. The physical hardships, the fever, the thirst, the marching, were manageable because they were external. They could be endured, treated, overcome through will. But the psychological pressures were different. They worked from inside, eroding the structures of certainty that held the mission together. The primary pressure was uncertainty. Stanley had no reliable information about Livingstone's location, condition, or even survival. The rumors he had gathered in Zanzibar were months old and contradictory. Some said Livingstone was at Ujiji. Others said he had moved west toward the Lualaba. Others said he was dead. Stanley was marching 750 miles into the interior of an unmapped continent on the basis of hearsay. And with each passing week, the hearsay grew older and less reliable. The possibility that he would arrive at Ujiji to find Livingstone gone or find nothing but a grave was a thought he could not afford to entertain and could not prevent from recurring. It surfaced at night when the camp was quiet and the sounds of the bush pressed in from every direction, and it surfaced during the long afternoon marches when the heat reduced thought to its most basic elements, and the mind, freed from the demands of decision-making, circled back to its deepest fears. The secondary pressure was authority. Stanley's position as expedition leader rested on nothing but his own force of personality and the wages he paid. He held no military rank. He represented no government. He carried no letters of commission from any African authority. His leadership was, in the most literal sense, a performance, a daily act of projecting confidence, competence, and control that had to be sustained without interruption. The moment the porters sensed weakness, the desertions would begin. The moment the guards concluded that the mission was doomed, they would melt away into the bush. Stanley knew this because he had studied the failures of previous expeditions, and the pattern was always the same. The leader falters, the men lose faith, the expedition disintegrates. He could not falter. He could not be seen to doubt. And so the doubt went underground, pushed down into a place where it could not be observed, but where it continued to exert pressure like water building behind a dam. He dealt with this pressure the only way he knew how, by increasing the intensity of his control over everything within his reach. He inspected loads more frequently. He punished infractions more harshly. He extended the marching hours. He reduced rest periods. The expedition became, under the pressure of its leader's anxiety, a tighter, more rigid, more brittle instrument, capable of extraordinary performance under optimal conditions, but increasingly vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic failure that occurs when a system has no flexibility left to absorb shock. The shock came in the form of the Malagarasi River. The Malagarasi was the last major obstacle before Ujiji, a broad, slow, crocodile-infested waterway that had to be crossed by ferry. The ferries were controlled by local chiefs who charged for the service, and the crossing required days of negotiation, payment, and patient waiting while the expedition's canoes were loaded and unloaded in small batches. Stanley could see the western bank, could see beyond it the hills that descended to Lake Tanganyika and the settlement where Livingstone might or might not be waiting. The proximity of the goal after months of hardship made the delay almost physically painful. He paced the riverbank, watching the slow progress of the canoes, counting the loads remaining, calculating and recalculating the hours until the crossing would be complete. It was during the Malagarasi crossing that word reached him, carried by a passing Arab trader, that a white man was indeed at Ujiji. The man was old, sick, and destitute. He had arrived from the west some weeks earlier and was living on the charity of the Arab trading community. He had no supplies, no medicines, no means of leaving. Stanley received this news with an outward composure that concealed an inner explosion of relief, excitement, and terror. Relief that Livingstone was alive, excitement that the story, the greatest story of his career, the story that would make his name immortal, was within reach. And terror, a specific, almost paralyzing terror, at the prospect of meeting the most famous man in the world while wearing the borrowed identity of a Welsh workhouse boy who had reinvented himself so many times that he was no longer entirely certain who he was. This is the dimension of the Stanley Livingstone encounter that most accounts overlook. The physical journey, the marching, the fever, the river crossings, was brutal but comprehensible. The psychological journey was something else entirely. Stanley was about to present himself to the most revered moral figure of the Victorian age as a representative of American journalism, a profession that Livingstone regarded with approximately the same enthusiasm he reserved for the slave trade. He was about to attempt to win the trust and affection of a man who had spent his life in the service of God and the abolition of human bondage, while concealing the fact that he himself had fought for the Confederacy, switched sides to save his skin, and built his entire identity on a foundation of strategic dishonesty. The gap between who Stanley was and who he needed Livingstone to believe he was, that gap was the real wilderness he had been crossing for 236 days. The expedition completed the Malagarasi crossing and entered the final stretch, the hill country descending to Lake Tanganyika. The landscape changed with a suddenness that felt like a reward. The dry thorn scrub of the plateau gave way to green, rolling hills covered in tall grass and dotted with mango and palm trees. Streams ran clear and cold through rocky channels. The air was cooler, lighter, easier to breathe. After months of punishing terrain, the country seemed to open its arms. Stanley pushed the pace. The men, sensing the end, responded. They covered the final 80 miles in 4 days, a pace that would have been impressive for a fresh expedition, let alone one that had been marching for nearly 8 months. Stanley distributed new cloth to his men so they would present a dignified appearance on arrival. He ordered the expedition's one American flag unfurled and carried at the head of the column. He loaded the expedition's muskets and instructed his men to fire a volley as they approached Ujiji, a signal to the settlement that visitors were arriving, but also, unmistakably, a piece of theater. Stanley was a journalist. He understood the power of spectacle, and the story he was about to create was one he intended to control from its first moment to its last. On the morning of November 10, 1871, the expedition descended the final hill above Ujiji. Below them, Lake Tanganyika stretched to the horizon, an inland sea of extraordinary beauty, its surface reflecting the sky in shades of blue and silver that seemed to belong to a different world than the one they had been traveling through. The settlement itself was a sprawl of mud brick buildings and thatched roofs clustered along the lakeshore, surrounded by groves of mango and coconut palm. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The sound of voices and the lowing of cattle carried up the hillside on the morning air. Stanley ordered the muskets fired. The volley cracked across the valley, echoing off the hills and sending a flock of egrets exploding from the lakeshore. At the front, his pith helmet brushed, 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 is at the front, his pith helmet brushed, his jacket buttoned despite the heat, his boots, miraculously, among the few pairs that had survived the journey, polished with the last of his blacking. The crowd parted as he entered the settlement. He could see ahead a semicircle of Arab traders standing before a low mud brick building, and among them, unmistakable despite the faded cap and the gaunt frame, a white man, an old man, a man whose eyes, even at a distance, carried the particular expression of someone who has stopped expecting anything from the world and is now confronted with the impossible. Stanley walked forward. The crowd pressed close. Susie and Chuma were there, Livingstone's faithful attendants, their faces showing an emotion that Stanley would later describe as a mixture of joy and bewilderment, as if they could not decide whether to laugh or weep. Stanley removed his pith helmet. He extended his hand. And here we arrive at the moment that has been repeated, parodied, analyzed, and mythologized for more than 150 years. The moment that Stanley spent the rest of his life both trading on and being trapped by. The moment that revealed in 4 words everything about who Henry Morton Stanley was and everything about who he was terrified of being. He said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" The formality of the greeting, its absurd, almost comical restraint in the face of circumstances that demanded raw human emotion, has been the subject of endless commentary. Why would a man who had just spent 8 months fighting his way across a continent, who had survived malaria and dysentery and the deaths of dozens of his men, who had arrived at the culmination of the most dramatic rescue mission of the century, why would that man greet his quarry with the stiff politeness of a gentleman meeting an acquaintance at a London dinner party? The answer lies in the workhouse. Stanley's entire life was a performance of respectability. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, every sentence he wrote was calibrated to maintain the fiction that he was a man of breeding, education, and social standing. The reality, the Welsh bastard, the workhouse, the beatings, the abandoned child, lived beneath the surface like a creature in deep water, invisible but always present, always capable of rising. In the most important moment of his life, with the eyes of history upon him, Stanley defaulted to the only defense he had ever known, the mask. The exaggerated formality was not a sign of emotional coldness, it was a sign of emotional terror. He was so afraid of revealing the depth of his need for recognition, for validation, for the approval of a father figure, that he encased the moment in the thickest armor he could find. Livingstone's response was, characteristically, simpler. He smiled. He said, "Yes, and I feel thankful that I am here to welcome you." Then he took Stanley's hand, and they walked together into the mud brick house, and the crowd closed behind them, and the most famous meeting in the history of exploration passed from the realm of event into the realm of legend. What followed was not a rescue. It was something stranger and more intimate, a 4-month friendship between two men who should have had nothing in common and who discovered in the isolation of a crumbling trading post on the shore of an African lake that they shared something deeper than profession or nationality or faith. They shared the experience of being driven by forces they could not fully explain toward goals they could not fully justify, through suffering they could not fully articulate. They were both, in their different ways, running. Livingstone from the obligations of domestic life and the limitations of a world that wanted him to stop, Stanley from the identity that clung to him like a shadow he could not outpace. Stanley had brought supplies, food, medicines, cloth, ammunition, and the effect on Livingstone was immediate and dramatic. The old man had been subsisting on boiled grain and whatever the Arab traders saw fit to share. Within days of Stanley's arrival, he was eating tinned meat, drinking coffee, dosing himself with fresh quinine. The ulcers on his legs began to close. His energy returned. His journal entries, which had dwindled to near illegibility, suddenly expanded. Longer passages, firmer handwriting, a renewed engagement with the world around him. Stanley, for his part, was transformed by Livingstone's company in ways he had not anticipated and could barely understand. He had arrived in Ujiji expecting to find a story, a broken old man in need of rescue, a piece of human drama that could be packaged and sold to the readers of the New York Herald. What he found instead was a man who possessed a quality that Stanley had never encountered in his life and had no framework for understanding. Livingstone was, in Stanley's presence, entirely without pretense. He was exactly who he appeared to be, a man consumed by a purpose he believed in, damaged by the pursuit of that purpose, and utterly uninterested in performing for anyone's benefit. He did not posture, he did not calculate, he did not manage his reputation or craft his image. He simply was. For a man whose entire existence was built on performance, this was a revelation that bordered on the religious. Stanley had never met anyone who did not wear a mask. He had never been in the presence of someone who made no effort to impress, and the effect was devastating in its simplicity. It made Stanley want, for the first time in his adult life, to remove his own mask. Not completely, never completely, but enough to allow something genuine to pass between them. The two men spent their days in conversation, long, rambling discussions that ranged from geography to theology to the politics of the slave trade. Livingstone talked about the Nile, about his conviction that the Lualaba was its source, about the massacre at Nyangwe, about the slave routes he had documented. Stanley listened with an attention that was not merely professional. He was not just gathering material for his dispatches, he was absorbing a world view, a way of seeing Africa and humanity and purpose that was fundamentally different from anything his own experience had produced. Livingstone saw the world as a place where suffering could be redeemed through witness and action. Stanley saw the world as a place where suffering was the default condition and survival was the only meaningful achievement. The two perspectives orbited each other for 4 months, never quite merging, never quite separating. They also explored together. In late November, they sailed north along the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika in canoes, investigating whether the lake had an outlet that might connect it to the Nile system. They reached the Ujiji River at the lake's northern end and discovered that it flowed into the lake, not out of it, a finding that eliminated Tanganyika as a direct source of the Nile and undercut one of Livingstone's cherished theories. Livingstone received this news with remarkable equanimity. He simply adjusted his hypothesis and proposed that the source must lie farther south in the rivers feeding Lake Bangweulu. The capacity to absorb contradictory evidence without abandoning the underlying conviction was one of Livingstone's most characteristic traits and one of his most dangerous. It meant that no amount of evidence could divert him from a course once he had committed to it. The source of the Nile had become, by this point, less a geographical question than a psychological one. Finding it was the only justification that could make the last 6 years of suffering, isolation, and failure mean something. Without it, he was simply an old man who had wandered into the bush and lost himself. Stanley understood this. He understood it because his own mission operated on the same emotional logic. Finding Livingstone was not, for Stanley, a journalistic assignment. It was the achievement that would make him real, that would transform Henry Morton Stanley from a fiction into a fact. Both men were searching for something that existed as much inside themselves as in the geography of Africa. And both men knew, at some level too deep for language, that finding it would not be enough. In mid-December, they returned to Ujiji. Stanley began preparing for his departure. He had what he came for: the story, the meeting, the dispatches that would make him the most famous journalist in the world. But leaving proved more difficult than arriving. Over the course of 4 months, something had formed between the two men that neither had vocabulary to describe. Stanley would later write about Livingstone with a tenderness he showed to no other human being in his life, a tenderness so uncharacteristic that his biographers have struggled to account for it. "I have lost a friend," he wrote after Livingstone's death. "He was the best man I ever knew." Stanley tried to persuade Livingstone to come home. He tried with every tool he possessed: logic, emotion, flattery, the promise of fame and comfort, the reminder that his children needed him, the plain medical fact that another rainy season in the interior would almost certainly kill him. He tried with the desperation of a man who had found something precious and could feel it slipping through his fingers. Livingstone refused. He refused with the gentle, immovable certainty of a man who had made his decision long before the question was asked. He could not leave Africa without settling the Nile question. He could not abandon the work that God had given him. He could not, and this was the reason beneath the reasons, the one he did not speak aloud. He could not return to a world where he would be expected to stop walking. England meant drawing rooms and lecture halls and the slow suffocation of domesticity. It meant being a monument to his own past rather than a participant in his own future. He was 60 years old, toothless, ulcerated, and hemorrhaging internally. He chose Africa. Stanley departed Ujiji on March 14, 1872, marching east toward the coast with Livingstone's journals, letters, and dispatches packed carefully among his supplies. The parting was, by Stanley's account, one of the most painful experiences of his life, which, given the inventory of suffering that life contained, was a statement of considerable weight. He described Livingstone standing at the edge of the settlement, waving, growing smaller against the backdrop of the lake until the trail curved and the old man disappeared from sight. Stanley walked for some distance in silence. Then, according to his own account, he wept. The tears were real. Whatever else Stanley fabricated or embellished in the long narrative of his life, the grief of that parting was not among his inventions. The evidence lies not in his public writings, which were always subject to the demands of self-presentation, but in his private diary, a document he never intended for publication and which was discovered among his papers after his death. The diary entries from the days following his departure from Ujiji are raw in a way that nothing else in Stanley's archive approaches. The handwriting is unsteady. The sentences are short and fragmented. He wrote, on the second night, "I have had some hard times in my life, but never did I feel so dispirited as on the first day of my return march." He reached the coast at Bagamoyo on May 6, 1872, after a 54-day march. He had been gone for nearly 14 months. He immediately began filing dispatches to the New York Herald, and the story broke across the English-speaking world like a thunderclap. Livingstone found. The headlines ran in papers from New York to London to Sydney. Stanley's account of the meeting, vivid, dramatic, brilliantly structured for maximum emotional impact, captivated a public that had given Livingstone up for dead. The 4 words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," became the most quoted sentence in the English language. Stanley was invited to lecture. He was celebrated. He was, for the first time in his life, famous. And then England turned on him. The backlash was swift, vicious, and rooted in the particular snobberies of Victorian class consciousness. The British establishment, the Royal Geographical Society, the Foreign Office, the gentlemen explorers who regarded African exploration as their exclusive preserve, could not tolerate the idea that an American journalist of no social standing and dubious credentials had accomplished what they had failed to do. They questioned his account. They questioned his motives. They questioned whether the meeting had actually occurred. The geographer, John Kirk, who served as British consul in Zanzibar and who had failed to resupply Livingstone despite repeated requests, led the charge against Stanley with a hostility that was personal, professional, and, beneath it all, deeply embarrassed. Kirk had been Livingstone's friend. Kirk had been entrusted with forwarding supplies to the interior. Kirk had failed, and now this brash American had succeeded, and the failure was public and humiliating. The criticism focused on 3 points. First, that Stanley's geographical observations were unreliable, that he had exaggerated distances, misidentified landmarks, and fabricated scientific findings. Second, that Stanley had mistreated his African porters, that his discipline was cruel, his methods authoritarian, and his attitude toward the people whose labor made his expedition possible was exploitative. Third, and most damagingly, that Stanley was not who he claimed to be, that Henry Morton Stanley was a fabricated identity, that the man behind the name was a Welsh workhouse boy with no education and no standing, and that his entire career was built on deception. The first charge was largely unfounded. Stanley's geographical observations, while not always precise, were broadly accurate, and his maps proved more useful than those produced by several of his critics. The second charge was more complex and more troubling. Stanley was, by any measure, a hard and sometimes harsh leader. He drove his men relentlessly. He punished deserters with flogging. He fired on hostile groups with a readiness that reflected military training more than diplomatic instinct. But the charge that he was uniquely cruel obscured a broader truth that the Victorian establishment preferred not to examine, that every European expedition into the African interior was built on the labor, suffering, and often the deaths of African porters who had limited choice in the matter and whose sacrifices were systematically erased from the official record. Stanley was not worse than the norm. The norm was the problem. The third charge, the exposure of his identity, was the one that cut deepest. Stanley spent years trying to suppress the truth about his origins, threatening legal action against anyone who published details of his early life, constructing ever more elaborate versions of his personal mythology. But the truth leaked out, piece by piece, through the investigations of hostile journalists and the testimony of people who had known John Rowlands before Henry Morton Stanley was born. Each revelation was a wound. Each wound drove him further into the defensive crouch that had defined his emotional life since childhood. The man who had walked across Africa to find Livingstone could not escape the workhouse. It followed him like a scent that no amount of achievement could wash away. But the public did not care about the establishment's objections. The public loved the story. Stanley's lectures drew crowds in the thousands. His book, How I Found Livingstone, became an international bestseller. The drama of the search, The romance of the meeting, the image of two white men clasping hands on the shore of an African lake, it was irresistible, and it elevated both Stanley and Livingstone to a level of celebrity that transcended the petty disputes of geographical societies and foreign offices. Stanley used the fame to secure what he had always wanted, a place in the world that no one could take from him. He had found Livingstone. No amount of snobbery could undo that. Meanwhile, in the interior of Africa, David Livingstone was dying. After Stanley's departure, Livingstone remained at Ujiji for several weeks, gathering strength and organizing supplies that Stanley had left for him. In August 1872, he set out once more, south and west, toward Lake Bangweulu and the swampy river systems where he believed the Nile's source still lay hidden. He took with him a small party that included his faithful attendants, Chuma and Susi, a handful of porters recruited from Ujiji, and a group of men Stanley had hired to accompany him. The total party numbered perhaps 60, a modest force for the country he intended to traverse. The journey south was a slow unraveling. Livingstone's body, briefly revived by Stanley's supplies, began its final decline almost as soon as the march began. The dysentery returned within weeks, draining him of fluid and nutrients faster than his diminished appetite could replace them. The internal bleeding, which he still attributed to the dysentery but which was almost certainly caused by a chronic condition, possibly a bleeding ulcer or an advanced parasitic infection of the intestinal wall, became more frequent and more severe. His journal entries recorded the blood with the same clinical detachment he brought to observations of wildlife and geography, as if the body producing the blood were a specimen under study rather than the vehicle carrying him through the bush. By October 1872, he had reached the southern end of Lake Tanganyika and turned west toward the Chambeshi River, which he still believed, despite every piece of contradictory evidence, was connected to the Nile system. The country he entered was a vast floodplain, seasonally inundated by the overflow of Lake Bangweulu and its feeder rivers. During the dry season, it was a landscape of tall grass and scattered woodland, populated by the Bemba and Bisa peoples who lived by fishing and farming. During the wet season, it became something else entirely, an inland sea of shallow, warm, opaque water stretching in every direction, broken only by the occasional island of higher ground where villages perched like birds on the backs of hippos. Livingstone arrived at the edge of this country just as the rains began. It was the worst possible timing. The water rose around him with the slow, implacable patience of a tide that has no schedule and no deadline. Within weeks, the trail he was following ceased to exist. The landmarks he had been using to navigate, trees, termite mounds, the lines of villages visible from higher ground, disappeared beneath a sheet of brown water that reflected the sky so perfectly it was impossible to tell where the land ended and the flood began. He pressed on. Of course he pressed on. Of course to stop was to die, and to turn back was to admit that the Nile's source would remain forever beyond his reach, an admission that would render the last 8 years of suffering meaningless. So he walked, through water that was ankle-deep, then knee-deep, then waist-deep, through mud that sucked at his feet with each step and released them with a sound like a kissing mouth, through clouds of mosquitoes that bred in the standing water and descended on the column with a density that made breathing difficult. His men waded beside him, holding their loads above their heads, the water warm as blood against their skin. His journal from this period is among the most harrowing documents in the literature of exploration. The entries grow shorter with each passing day, the handwriting deteriorating from cramped but legible script to a wavering scrawl that trails across the page like the track of an insect dipped in ink. He recorded distances that were pitifully small: 2 miles, 1.5 miles, a single mile, each one representing hours of wading through flooded country under a sun that burned through the overcast with a diffuse, headache-inducing glare. He recorded the blood. He recorded the weakness. He recorded, on January 31st, 1873, a passage that reads like the testimony of a man negotiating with his own extinction. "I am pale, bloodless, and weak from bleeding profusely ever since the 31st of March last. An artery gives off a copious stream and takes away my strength. Oh, how I long to be permitted by the overpower to finish my work. The overpower. Not God in this passage, but the overpower, a formulation that suggests perhaps a subtle shift in Livingstone's theology, a movement from the personal interventionist God of his Calvinist upbringing toward something vaster and less familiar. Or perhaps it suggests nothing more than the mental effects of chronic blood loss and fever. The line between spiritual insight and delirium is thin, and in Livingstone's final months, it became invisible. By March 1873, the expedition had become a funeral procession that had not yet acknowledged its purpose. Livingstone could no longer walk. His men carried him on a makeshift litter, a frame of poles with a blanket stretched between them, through the flooded landscape, wading with the dying man held above the water like an offering. Chuma and Susie took turns at the front of the litter, their faces set with an expression that combined determination and grief in proportions that shifted with each passing day. They had been with Livingstone for years. They knew he was dying. He knew they knew. None of them spoke of it. The question that hangs over these final weeks is one that has no satisfying answer. Why did Chuma, Susie, and the other African members of the expedition continue? They were not bound by contract. The expedition had long since ceased to function as a commercial enterprise, and there was no one to enforce any agreement even if one had existed. They were not motivated by the promise of reward. Livingstone had nothing to give them and no guarantee that anyone would honor his debts after his death. They were not compelled by force. Livingstone could barely lift his head, let alone compel anyone to do anything. They continued because of something that the colonial narrative has never been able to adequately explain and has generally preferred to ignore: a bond of loyalty, respect, and what can only be called love that had formed between these African men and the Scottish missionary over years of shared hardship. Chuma had been with Livingstone since 1861, when Livingstone had freed him from a slave caravan as a boy. Susie had joined the expedition in 1866 and had stayed through every disaster, every privation, every abandoned plan. These men were not servants in any meaningful sense. They were partners whose contributions to the exploration of the African interior were as great as Livingstone's own, but whose names for more than a century appeared only in footnotes. On April 29, 1873, the expedition reached the village of Chitambo in the country of the Ilala people, near the southern shore of Lake Bangweulu. Livingstone was carried into a hut that the villagers prepared for him. He was placed on a bed of sticks and grass, and his men built a small shelter around him to keep out the rain that had been falling for days. He was, by this point, barely conscious. The hemorrhaging had reduced him to a state of profound anemia. His skin was gray, his lips were white, his pulse was barely detectable. He drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally murmuring words that his attendants strained to hear. On the evening of April 30th, he roused himself enough to ask Susie a question. "Is this the Luapula?" he asked, referring to the river he believed connected Lake Bangweulu to the Nile system. Susie told him they were near the lake, but not yet at the Luapula. Livingstone said nothing more. He asked Susie to bring him his medicine chest, took a dose of calomel, and asked to be left alone. Sometime during the night of April 30th or the early hours of May 1st, 1873, Livingstone died. His attendants found him in the morning, kneeling beside his bed with his head resting on his hands, as if in prayer. He had apparently risen during the night, knelt down, and died in that position. Whether he was praying or reaching for something, or simply collapsing under the final failure of his body, no one can say. The image, the missionary dying on his knees, became one of the defining icons of the Victorian age. It was like so much about Livingstone, both genuine and mythological at the same time. He really was found kneeling. The meaning imposed upon that posture was a construction of the living. What happened next was extraordinary. Chuma and Susie, faced with the death of the man they had followed for years through the heart of a continent, made a decision that had no precedent in the history of exploration and that speaks to a depth of devotion that the colonial narrative has never been able to diminish despite decades of trying. They decided to carry Livingstone's body to the coast, a distance of over 1,000 miles, so that it could be returned to England for burial. The logistics of this undertaking were staggering. They were in the middle of a flooded wilderness, more than 600 miles from the nearest point on the coast where a European ship might be found. They had limited supplies, no European leadership, and no guarantee that the body could be preserved over the weeks or months the journey would require. The rainy season was not yet over. The slave trade routes they would need to follow were dangerous. Several of the porters, upon learning of Livingstone's death, immediately deserted. Chuma and Susie proceeded with a competence and a calm that demolish any notion that the African members of European expeditions were mere followers awaiting instruction. They removed Livingstone's internal organs, heart, liver, intestines, and buried them beneath a mpundu tree near the spot where he died, in a ceremony that combined Christian prayer with local Ilala custom. They preserved the body by packing it with salt and drying it in the sun for 2 weeks until the flesh was desiccated enough to survive transport. They wrapped the body in bark, then in a sailcloth, creating a cylindrical package that could be carried on a pole between 2 men. They packed Livingstone's journals, instruments, and personal effects with meticulous care, understanding that these documents were the real treasure, the record of everything Livingstone had seen, endured, and witnessed during his final years. Then they began to walk. The journey from Chitambo to the coast took 9 months. 9 months of carrying a dead man through the same landscape that had killed him, through the floods, the fevers, the territorial disputes, the ever-present shadow of the slave trade. Chuma and Susie led the party with an authority that none of the remaining men challenged. They navigated by routes they had learned during years of travel with Livingstone. They negotiated passage through hostile territories, using skills they had developed not in any European training program, but in the practical school of African diplomacy, where the wrong word to the wrong chief could mean the annihilation of the entire party. They faced resistance. Some chiefs refused them passage, suspicious of the strange cargo. Others demanded tribute they could not pay. At one point, they were forced to disguise the body, wrapping it in fresh cloth and carrying it in a manner that suggested trade goods rather than human remains, to avoid the taboo that many peoples attach to the transport of corpses. They improvised, adapted, and endured with a resourcefulness that would have earned them fame and honor had they been European. Instead, their names were recorded in the margins of someone else's story. They reached Bagamoyo in February 1874, 10 months after Livingstone's death. The body was transferred to a British ship and carried to England, where it arrived in April. The nation that had largely forgotten Livingstone during his final years of wandering now reclaimed him with a fervor that bordered on the hysterical. His body lay in state at the Royal Geographical Society. Crowds filed past the coffin for days. On April 18, 1874, David Livingstone was buried in Westminster Abbey among the kings and poets of England, in a ceremony attended by the most powerful figures in British public life. The pallbearers included Stanley, who had traveled from America for the funeral, and Jacob Wainwright, one of the African members of the expedition who had been brought to England for the occasion. Wainwright stood in Westminster Abbey in borrowed clothes, surrounded by a civilization that had built its wealth on the labor of people who looked like him, and helped carry to its final rest a man who had spent his life trying to end that exploitation, while simultaneously providing the moral framework that would be used to justify its continuation. Chuma and Susie were not invited to the funeral. They received a modest cash payment for their services and returned to East Africa. Their oral testimonies were recorded by Horace Waller, who edited them extensively, removing passages that complicated the narrative of Livingstone as saintly martyr and inserting interpretations that served the missionary establishment's purposes. The original, unedited voices of the 2 men who knew Livingstone best during his final years, who carried his body 1,000 miles through the wilderness, who buried his heart beneath an African tree, were filtered through a European editorial apparatus that preserved the facts while stripping away the perspective. It was a fitting coda to a life that had been, from its beginning, a collaboration between European ambition and African labor, in which the credit flowed reliably in one direction. Livingstone's death did not end the story. It accelerated it. The outpouring of grief and admiration that accompanied his funeral created a wave of public sentiment that the British government could not ignore. Livingstone's journals, published posthumously in 1874 as the last journals of David Livingstone, provided the evidence he had spent his final years accumulating. The descriptions of the slave caravans, the Nyangwe massacre, the systematic destruction of communities across the interior, all of it landed on a British public that was already primed by decades of abolitionist activism to respond with moral outrage. The government came under intense pressure to act, and in 1873, even before Livingstone's body reached England, the British consul in Zanzibar, under instructions from London, pressured Sultan Bargash to sign a treaty abolishing the slave market. The market at Zanzibar, where Livingstone had watched a woman sold while her infant was ignored, was closed. An Anglican cathedral was built on the site. The altar was placed on the exact spot where the whipping post had stood. It was a victory. It was Livingstone's victory, purchased with 30 years of walking and dying in the African interior. And it was genuine. The closure of the Zanzibar market significantly reduced the volume of the East African slave trade, and the treaty that followed imposed restrictions that saved an unknowable but substantial number of human lives. But the closure of the slave market did not close the question that Livingstone's life had opened. It enlarged it. Because the same moral framework that Livingstone had used to argue against the slave trade, the 3 C's of Christianity, commerce, and civilization, was now available for a very different purpose. The argument ran like this: Africa was a continent of darkness and suffering. The slave trade was proof of that darkness. European civilization was the cure. If legitimate commerce could replace the slave trade, and if Christianity could replace what Europeans perceived as African barbarism, then the penetration of the African interior by European powers was not merely justified, it was a moral obligation. The scramble for Africa, the frantic, violent, catastrophic carving up of the continent by European powers that would consume the final quarter of the 19th century, found in Livingstone's legacy its most potent justification. Livingstone would have been horrified. He wanted commerce, not conquest. He wanted Africans to trade freely with the world, not to be subjugated by it. He believed, naively perhaps, but sincerely, that European contact would benefit African peoples, that the exchange of goods and ideas would flow in both directions, that the civilizations of the interior were worthy of respect, even as he sought to change them. But the language he had created, the vocabulary of darkness and light, of rescue and civilization, of moral obligation and benevolent intervention, that language proved infinitely adaptable. It could justify a missionary station. It could also justify a rubber plantation. It could justify a school. It could also justify a forced labor camp. The distance between Livingstone's intentions and the uses to which his legacy was put is the central tragedy of his life, a tragedy he did not live to witness, but which was already taking shape before his body reached Westminster Abbey. And the man who would bridge that distance, who would carry Livingstone's moral language into the heart of Africa and use it to build something Livingstone could never have imagined, was already planning his return. Stanley received the news of Livingstone's death in early 1874. The grief was genuine, but it was accompanied by something else, a sense of unfinished business that had the weight and urgency of a calling. Livingstone had died without finding the source of the Nile. He had died without completing the map of the African interior. He had died, most importantly, without opening the continent to the commerce and civilization that he believed would redeem it. Stanley decided, with the characteristic speed of a man who processed emotion through action, that he would complete Livingstone's work. He would return to Africa, trace the great river systems that Livingstone had spent his final years pursuing, and settle the geographical questions that remained unanswered. He would do what Livingstone could not because he was better, but because he was younger, stronger, and willing to use methods that Livingstone's conscience would never have permitted. The expedition he assembled was, by the standards of African exploration, unprecedented in its scale and ambition. Funded jointly by the New York Herald and the London Daily Telegraph, it comprised more than 350 men, porters, guards, guides, and a core team of experienced African veterans, equipped with enough supplies, weapons, and trade goods to sustain operations for at least 2 years. Stanley carried with him a collapsible boat, the Lady Alice, named after the woman he intended to marry upon his return. He carried Sniper rifles, enough ammunition for a small war, and a determination that would prove in the months ahead to be both his greatest asset and the source of his most damning legacy. He departed from Bagamoyo on November 17, 1874, and marched into the interior with the disciplined efficiency of a military operation. The expedition moved faster than any previous venture of comparable size, covering distances that previous explorers had taken weeks to traverse in a matter of days. Stanley imposed a regimen of march discipline that left no room for delay, negotiation, or the kind of cultural engagement that had characterized Livingstone's approach. When tribal leaders demanded tribute, Stanley paid if it was practical and fought if it was not. When porters deserted, he pursued them and punished them. When hostile groups threatened the column, he deployed his rifles with a speed and decisiveness that ended confrontations before they could develop into sustained conflicts. He reached Lake Victoria in February 1875 and spent the next several months circumnavigating it in the Lady Alice, mapping its shoreline and confirming that it was a single body of water, not the cluster of smaller lakes that some geographers had proposed. He identified the Ripon Falls as the lake's outlet and confirmed definitively that John Hanning's speak had been correct. Lake Victoria was the primary source of the White Nile. The question that had consumed Livingstone's final years, that had driven him through the swamps of Bangulu and kept him walking until his body failed, was answered. Livingstone had been wrong. The Nile's source was not where he believed it to be. The river he had followed, the Lualaba, was not the Nile at all. It was the Congo. This realization transformed the expedition from a geographical survey into something far more consequential. Stanley stood at the headwaters of a river system that drained over 1 million square miles of the African interior, a basin larger than Western Europe, covered in the densest tropical forest on the planet, populated by peoples no European had ever contacted, and flowing through a landscape that was, in the most literal sense, the last blank space on the map of the world. The Lualaba, which Livingstone had traced with such agonizing devotion, was the Upper Congo. And the Congo flowed not north toward Egypt and the Mediterranean, but west, 2,700 miles west, through the equatorial forest and over a series of cataracts so violent they defied navigation to the Atlantic coast. Stanley decided to follow it. The decision was made with the same blend of ambition and recklessness that had carried him to Ujiji 4 years earlier. No European had ever navigated the Congo. No European had ever entered the equatorial forest that lined its banks for more than 1,000 miles. The peoples of the region were unknown, their disposition toward strangers untested. The river itself was a mystery. Its course, its cataracts, its tributaries, the sheer volume of water it carried, all of it existed beyond the edge of European knowledge, in a darkness that was geographical rather than moral, but that would, in the years to come, provide the metaphorical vocabulary for one of history's most devastating colonial enterprises. Stanley launched the Lady Alice on the Lualaba in late October 1876. His expedition had already been in the field for nearly 2 years. The original complement of 350 men had been reduced by disease, desertion, and combat to fewer than 150. The survivors were hardened, exhausted, and bound together by the shared experience of having come too far to turn back. They had crossed the breadth of equatorial Africa on foot, fought more than a dozen engagements with hostile groups, buried their companions in unmarked graves across 1,000 miles of bush, and arrived at the banks of a river that would demand of them more than everything they had already given. The Lualaba below Nyangwe, the town where Livingstone had witnessed the massacre 2 years before Stanley's arrival, flowed north through country that grew progressively more densely forested with each mile. The river itself was enormous, in places more than a mile wide, its current sluggish and dark, the color of strong tea from the tannins leached out of the forest floor. The water was warm to the touch, The surface was dotted with floating islands of water hyacinth that drifted downstream like green rafts, sometimes carrying snakes and monitor lizards that regarded the passing canoes with reptilian indifference. Hippopotami surfaced and submerged in the shallows with a regularity that made them seem less like animals than like features of the river itself, organic buoys marking the channel's depth. The forest pressed in from both banks with an intensity that made the river feel less like a waterway than a tunnel. Trees rose 150 feet above the water, their canopies interlocking overhead to form a ceiling of green so dense that the light filtering through it was submarine, greenish, diffuse, directionless. Beneath the canopy, the air was thick, wet, and still, saturated with the smell of decomposition and growth occurring simultaneously, the forest consuming its own dead and producing new life in the same breath. Vines as thick as a man's thigh descended from the canopy to the water's edge. The roots of the great trees spread across the riverbank in tangled networks that resembled, in the half-light, the fingers of enormous hands gripping the earth. The sound was unlike anything the expedition had experienced. The forest produced a continuous layered noise, the screaming of monkeys, the drilling of woodpeckers, the buzzing of insects in densities that turned the air into a vibrating medium, the sudden crash of a falling branch, the low hooting of unseen birds, and beneath it all, a bass note that was not any single sound, but the accumulated resonance of billions of organisms living, feeding, breeding, and dying in an ecosystem so complex that the human mind could not hold it all at once. At night, the noise intensified rather than diminished. The darkness was absolute. The river, invisible but audible, moved past the camp with a sound like slow breathing, and from the forest came calls and cries that the men could not identify, and that their imaginations, freed from the discipline of sight, transformed into threats of unlimited variety. Stanley navigated this world with the Lady Alice at the head of a flotilla of dugout canoes, acquired through trade and, when trade failed, through force. The distinction between the two was, in Stanley's practice, less clearly drawn than it should have been. His method of acquiring canoes followed a pattern that repeated with variations along the length of the river. Approach a riverside village, attempt to communicate peaceful intentions through interpreters whose languages were often incompatible with the local tongues, offer trade goods in exchange for canoes and food, and if the offer was refused, or if the village responded with hostility, which was frequent as many of these communities had experience of slave raiders arriving by water, deploy the Snider rifles to clear the riverbank and take what was needed. Stanley recorded more than 30 engagements with riverside peoples during the descent of the Congo. Some were brief exchanges of arrows and gunfire across the water. Others were sustained running battles that lasted for hours as the flotilla was pursued downstream by war canoes manned by warriors whose skill with paddles and spears was far superior to anything the expedition could match in watercraft. The war canoes of the Upper Congo were extraordinary vessels, carved from single logs up to 80 feet long, paddled by crews of 40 or 50 men who moved with a synchronized precision that generated astonishing speed, and carrying warriors armed with bows, spears, and shields, decorated with patterns that Stanley found beautiful even as the arrows flew. Stanley described these encounters in his journals and subsequent book with a vividness that borders on the cinematic. He had an eye for the choreography of violence, the formation of the war canoes, the rhythm of the paddles, the arc of the arrows against the green backdrop of the forest. He also had a journalist's instinct for framing these encounters in terms that justified his own use of force. In Stanley's telling, every engagement was defensive. He never attacked first. He always offered peace before resorting to arms. The bullets that killed men and women along the riverbanks were always fired in self-defense, always regrettable, always the fault of the people who had failed to recognize his peaceful intentions. The reality was more complicated. Stanley was traveling through country where the only previous contact with outsiders had been with slave raiders, Arab and Swahili traders who arrived by river, attacked villages, and carried away their inhabitants. The communities along the Upper Congo had every reason to regard a large, armed party descending the river as a threat, and their response, mobilizing their warriors, deploying their canoes, attacking before they could be attacked, was not aggression but self-defense. Stanley understood this at some level. His journal contains passages that acknowledge the perspective of the people he was fighting. He noted their bravery, their tactical skill, their understandable suspicion of strangers. But this understanding coexisted with a willingness to kill that the understanding did not moderate. The mission came first. The river had to be navigated. The map had to be made. And if the people who lived along the river's bank stood in the way of the map, then the Snider rifles would clear the way. The cost of this approach was measured in bodies that Stanley counted with the same methodical attention he brought to geographical observations, except that the bodies on the riverbank were enumerated in round numbers and without names, while the bodies in his own expedition were recorded individually. He estimated that his men killed several hundred people during the descent of the Congo. The number may have been higher. The people he killed had no chroniclers, no archives, no one to record their names and the manner of their deaths. They exist in Stanley's narrative as obstacles overcome, as evidence of the river's danger, as proof of the explorer's courage. They do not exist as people. This erasure, this reduction of human beings to the status of landscape features, dangerous but ultimately peripheral to the story being told, was not unique to Stanley. It was the foundational grammar of European exploration narrative, and Stanley spoke it fluently. The river carried them north and then west, curving through the equatorial forest in a vast arc that mirrored the curve of the continent itself. As they moved downstream, the character of the river changed. The broad, sluggish upper reaches gave way to a succession of rapids and cataracts where the Congo, compressed between walls of rock, accelerated to speeds that made navigation impossible, and portage, the hauling of boats and supplies overland around the obstacles, a labor of extraordinary difficulty and danger. The first major cataracts, which Stanley named Stanley Falls, in a gesture of self-commemoration that Livingstone would have found distasteful, were a series of 7 cascades spread over 60 miles of river, each one a chaos of white water, submerged rocks, and standing waves that could flip a loaded canoe in an instant. The expedition lost men at every cataract. Canoes overturned in the rapids, spilling their occupants and cargo into water that was moving too fast for rescue. Men who could not swim, and many could not, having been recruited from inland peoples who had no tradition of aquatic life, went under and did not come up. Supplies that had been carried 1,000 miles were swept downstream and lost. The Lady Alice herself was nearly destroyed on the 4th cataract. Her hull scraped across a submerged ledge that tore a gash in her copper bottom and required hours of emergency repair on a sandbar, while the river thundered past on both sides. Stanley's response to these losses was characteristic. He recorded them, calculated their impact on the expedition's operational capacity, adjusted his plans accordingly, and kept moving. The deaths produced no visible emotional response in his journals, no passages of grief, no moments of self-doubt, no questioning of the mission's justification. This was not because Stanley was incapable of emotion. The diary entries following his departure from Livingstone prove otherwise. It was because the emotion had been redirected, channeled entirely into the forward momentum of the expedition, converted from feeling into fuel. Every death increased the stakes. Every loss of supplies shortened the timeline. Every engagement with riverside peoples reminded Stanley that stopping meant dying. The only direction that contained the possibility of survival was downstream. Below the falls, the river widened again and entered a stretch of relatively calm water that provided a brief, deceptive respite. The forest canopy opened in places, revealing sky, and the expedition emerged from the green tunnel into a landscape that was still forested but less oppressively so, the trees set farther apart, the undergrowth thinner, the light more generous. Villages appeared along the banks with greater frequency, and some of these encounters were peaceful. Stanley traded cloth and beads for food, cassava, bananas, dried fish, and his men ate well for the first time in weeks. The expedition's botanist, Frank Pocock, one of only 3 European members of the party, was able to collect specimens and make observations of the forest ecology that would later contribute to scientific understanding of the Congo Basin. But Pocock would not survive to see his observations published. The river that had given them a brief respite was gathering itself for its final devastating assault. In late February 1877, the expedition reached the point where the Congo begins its descent from the interior plateau to the coastal plain, a drop of nearly 1,000 feet over a distance of 220 miles. This descent was accomplished not through a single dramatic waterfall, but through a series of 32 cataracts that Stanley named the Livingstone Falls, in honor of the man whose legacy had brought him here. The naming was both a tribute and a claim, a declaration that the work Livingstone had begun was now being completed by his successor, and that the two names would be linked forever on the map of Africa. The Livingstone Falls were not falls in the conventional sense. They were a continuous gauntlet of rapids, whirlpools, gorges, and cascades that stretched for month after month of grinding, brutal progress. The Congo, which above the falls had been a mile wide and moving at a leisurely pace, was here compressed into channels as narrow as 200 yards, and the entire volume of the river, the accumulated rainfall of a drainage basin larger than India, was forced through these channels at speeds that defied measurement. The water was not simply moving fast. It was moving with a force that was geological rather than hydrological, a force that had, over millions of years, carved a canyon through the plateau rock that was, in places, deeper than the Grand Canyon. Navigation was impossible. Every mile had to be portaged. The canoes hauled out of the water, carried overland through dense vegetation and across rocky terrain, then lowered back into the river below the obstruction. The Lady Alice, which had been designed for lakes and calm rivers, was alternately carried and dragged through country that destroyed her hull faster than it could be repaired. The work was shattering. Men hauled loads up slopes so steep they had to cut steps in the rock. They lowered canoes down cliffs using ropes woven from forest vines. They waded through ravines where the spray from the rapids soaked them to the skin, and the noise made verbal communication impossible. Each cataract consumed days, sometimes weeks, and the food supply dwindled with a speed that turned every delay into a small catastrophe. It was during the portage of the fifth cataract that Frank Pocock drowned. He was attempting to guide a canoe through a stretch of rapids that Stanley had judged marginally navigable, and the canoe struck a submerged rock, overturned, and threw Pocock into water that was moving at approximately 30 miles an hour. He was seen once, his arm above the surface, grasping at nothing, and then he was gone. His body was never recovered. Stanley recorded the death in his journal with a brevity that masked whatever he felt beneath it. Frank Pocock is dead, drowned in the rapids. He was a brave man and a good companion. 3 sentences. Then the expedition moved on. Stanley was now the only surviving European member of the expedition. His original party of 350 had been reduced to fewer than 120. The survivors were emaciated, many of them sick, all of them exhausted beyond the point where exhaustion is an adequate word. They had been in the field for more than 2.5 years. They had crossed the width of Africa, circumnavigated its largest lake, descended its largest river, and fought more engagements than any of them could accurately count. The knowledge that the Atlantic Ocean lay somewhere ahead, that the river must eventually reach the sea, was the only thing that kept them moving. That knowledge and the will of the man who led them, a will that had been forged in a Welsh workhouse and tempered in the fires of abandonment and self-invention until it was harder than the basalt through which the Congo had cut its canyon. The final weeks of the descent were a blur of cataracts, portages, starvation, and death. Stanley sent messengers ahead, hoping to reach the European trading posts that he knew existed near the mouth of the Congo. The messengers carried letters written in English and French, addressed to any gentleman who speaks English and requesting food and supplies. The letters were a gamble. The messengers had to navigate country they did not know among peoples they had never encountered, carrying documents in languages they could not read. The odds of any letter reaching its destination were negligible, but one did. On August 3, 1877, a reply arrived, carried by messengers from the trading post at Boma, near the mouth of the Congo, along with supplies of food, cloth, and medicine. The effect on the expedition was electric. Men who had been stumbling through the bush in a state of near collapse suddenly straightened, their eyes clearing, their pace quickening. The food, tinned goods, rice, sugar, tea, tasted, by Stanley's account, like nothing he had ever eaten. The sugar, dissolved in river water, produced a sweetness that made several men weep. On August 9, 1877, 999 days after leaving Bagamoyo on the Indian Ocean coast, Henry Morton Stanley and the surviving members of his expedition reached the trading post at Boma on the Congo River within sight of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 356 people who had set out from the east coast, 114 arrived at the west. 242 were dead, killed by disease, drowning, starvation, combat, and the accumulated effects of nearly 3 years of sustained hardship in some of the most demanding terrain on Earth. Among the dead were all 3 of Stanley's European companions. Among the survivors were the African men and women whose names appear only in the expedition's muster rolls and whose individual stories, their courage, their suffering, their reasons for continuing when every rational calculus argued for stopping, were never recorded. Stanley's crossing of Africa was the greatest feat of exploration in the 19th century. It was also, in its methods and its consequences, a preview of the catastrophe that was about to engulf the continent. The map Stanley had drawn, the river he had traced, the cataracts he had catalogued, the peoples he had contacted and, in many cases, fought, was not merely a geographical document, it was an invitation. It showed the world that the Congo Basin was accessible, that its rivers could be navigated, that its peoples could be overcome, and that its resources, ivory, rubber, palm oil, copper, and the vast labor force required to extract them, were available to anyone with the will and the weapons to take them. The invitation was accepted by a man who had been watching Stanley's progress with the patient attention of a spider monitoring a web. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians, and he had been planning the conquest of the Congo Basin for years, not as a colonial venture of the Belgian state, which had no interest in African empire, but as a personal business enterprise, a private fiefdom operated for the sole purpose of enriching its owner. Leopold was a man of considerable intelligence, limitless greed, and a genius for public relations that would have been remarkable in any era, and was, in the late 19th century, virtually without parallel. He understood, with a clarity that eluded most of his contemporaries, that the language of humanitarianism could be used to disguise the reality of exploitation, that if you wrapped commerce in the vocabulary of civilization, philanthropy, and the abolition of the slave trade, you could do almost anything and be applauded for it. Leopold had already established the International Association of the Congo, an organization with a name designed to suggest multilateral cooperation and humanitarian purpose, but which was, in practice, a vehicle for Leopold's personal ambitions. He had hired agents, established trading posts, and negotiated treaties with African chiefs along the lower Congo, treaties that the chiefs could not read and that transferred sovereignty over their territories to Leopold in exchange for bolts of cloth and bottles of gin. What Leopold lacked was a man capable of turning these paper claims into physical control, a man who could build roads, establish stations, negotiate with or defeat resistant populations, and create the infrastructure of extraction that would make the Congo profitable. He found that man in Stanley. The seduction of Henry Morton Stanley by Leopold II is one of the most consequential encounters in modern history, and it was conducted with a subtlety that Stanley, for all his shrewdness, failed to recognize until it was too late. Leopold understood Stanley perfectly. He understood that beneath the explorer's bravado and the journalist's cynicism lay the same wound that had driven Stanley across Africa: the need for recognition, for legitimacy, for a place in the world that could not be taken away. The British establishment had rejected Stanley. The Royal Geographical Society had questioned his methods. The gentlemen explorers had sneered at his origins. Leopold offered what Britain would not: respect, partnership, a mission that combined exploration with the highest humanitarian purpose. He offered Stanley the chance to complete Livingstone's work, to open the Congo to commerce and civilization, to suppress the slave trade, to bring light to the darkness. The language was Livingstone's. The purpose was Leopold's. And Stanley, hearing the words that Livingstone had taught him to revere, did not look closely enough at the mouth that spoke them. In 1879, Stanley returned to the Congo as Leopold's agent. He spent the next 5 years building a network of trading stations along the river, constructing a road around the Livingstone Falls, the same cataracts that had nearly killed him 2 years earlier, and negotiating the treaties that would give Leopold legal control over a territory of nearly 1 million square miles. Stanley worked with his characteristic energy and ruthlessness, driving his laborers to the limits of endurance, clearing forest, blasting rock, hauling steamboats overland in sections to be reassembled above the cataracts. The African workers who built Leopold's road died in numbers that were never accurately counted. They were conscripted from local communities, fed inadequately, worked beyond exhaustion, and discarded when they were no longer useful. Stanley did not invent the system of forced labor that would later consume the Congo, but he built the infrastructure on which that system operated. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, convened by Otto von Bismarck to settle competing European claims in Africa, recognized Leopold's personal sovereignty over the Congo Basin. The territory was not a Belgian colony. It was a private estate, the Congo Free State, owned and operated by Leopold II as his personal property. The name was a masterpiece of Orwellian euphemism. There was nothing free about it. The population, estimated at 20 million people, had been signed away by chiefs who did not understand what they were signing, in transactions witnessed by agents whose salaries were paid by the man who benefited from the signatures. The entire enterprise was built on a scaffolding of legal fictions so transparent that they would have collapsed under the weight of honest scrutiny. But scrutiny was not forthcoming. The European powers, busy with their own scrambles for African territory, were content to let Leopold have his estate, provided he kept the Congo River open to international trade and maintained the fiction of humanitarian purpose that justified the whole arrangement. Livingstone's ghost presided over the conference like a benediction. His name was invoked repeatedly by Leopold, by his agents, by the diplomats who signed the final act: the suppression of the slave trade, the advancement of civilization, the opening of Africa to commerce and Christianity. These were Livingstone's words, Livingstone's dream, and they were being used to authorize the creation of a system that would prove, in its scope and its cruelty, to be worse than the slave trade it claimed to replace. The Congo Free State operated on a simple economic model: extraction. The territory's primary resource in the early years was ivory, the tusks of elephants that roamed the Congo Basin in herds that had never been hunted with modern weapons. Leopold's agents established a network of stations along the river system, each one a center of collection where ivory was gathered from the surrounding territory and shipped downstream to the coast. The collection was accomplished through a system of forced tribute. Each village in the territory was required to deliver a specified quantity of ivory to the nearest station at regular intervals. Villages that met their quotas were left in relative peace. Villages that failed were punished. The punishments were systematic and designed not merely to coerce compliance, but to terrorize the population into submission. Soldiers of the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, officered by Europeans and manned by conscripted Africans, would enter a village that had failed to meet its quota and implement what the officers euphemistically called enforcement measures. Hostages were taken, usually women and children, and held until the required ivory was produced. Houses were burned, fields were destroyed, and men who resisted or attempted to flee were killed, their right hands severed and presented to the station officers as proof that the ammunition used to kill them had not been wasted on unauthorized targets. The severed hands became the defining atrocity of the Congo Free State. They were not an aberration, they were policy, a bureaucratic mechanism designed to account for the expenditure of bullets, which were expensive and which Leopold's administration monitored with the same attention it devoted to ivory revenues. Each bullet issued to a soldier of the Force Publique was expected to produce a corresponding hand. Soldiers who could not produce hands to match their ammunition expenditure were themselves punished. The result was a system of mutilation so pervasive that it generated its own internal economy. Soldiers who wished to conserve ammunition for hunting began severing the hands of living people. creating a category of suffering that even the slave trade, in its most brutal expressions, had not achieved. The scale of what happened in the Congo Free State between 1885 and 1908 is difficult to comprehend and impossible to state with precision. Demographic estimates suggest that the population of the territory declined by approximately half during this period, from roughly 20 million to roughly 10 million. The causes of death included direct violence, starvation resulting from the destruction of agricultural communities, disease, particularly sleeping sickness which spread along the trade routes that Leopold's agents had established, and a catastrophic decline in birth rates produced by the forced separation of families and the physical destruction of women of childbearing age. 10 million people. The number is approximate. The suffering it represents is not. Stanley knew what was happening in the Congo. He could not have failed to know. He had built the roads. He had established the stations. He had negotiated the treaties. He had, with his own hands and the labor of thousands of Africans whose names he never recorded, constructed the physical infrastructure through which Leopold's system of extraction operated. The steamboats that carried ivory downstream were the same steamboats Stanley had hauled in pieces around the Livingstone Falls. The stations where hostages were held and hands were severed were the same stations Stanley had sited, built, and staffed. The force publique that terrorized the population into compliance was organized along lines that Stanley himself had recommended. The connection between the explorer and the atrocity was not metaphorical. It was architectural. And yet, Stanley's public response to the mounting evidence of horror in the Congo was silence. Not the silence of ignorance. He maintained contacts in the territory and received reports from agents who described conditions with varying degrees of candor. Not the silence of indifference. His private papers suggest a man who was troubled by what he heard, but who could not bring himself to confront its implications. It was the silence of a man who understood that acknowledging the truth would require him to acknowledge his own role in creating it, and that this acknowledgement would destroy the achievement on which his entire identity rested. The Congo was Stanley's masterwork. It was the proof that the workhouse boy had become a man of consequence. To admit that the masterwork was a catastrophe, that the roads he had built led to slaughter, that the stations he had established had become torture chambers, that the map he had drawn had become a blueprint for genocide, was to admit that Henry Morton Stanley, the self-made hero of African exploration, had been Leopold's instrument all along. The fiction could not survive that admission, and without the fiction, there was nothing. So Stanley said nothing. He attended banquets. He gave lectures about the civilizing mission of European commerce in Africa. He published books in which the Congo was presented as a land of limitless promise, awaiting only the application of European energy and capital to yield its treasures for the benefit of all mankind. He accepted honors from Leopold, decorations, titles, invitations to the royal palace, with the gratitude of a man who had finally found the patron his childhood had denied him. The relationship between Stanley and Leopold was, in its psychological structure, a grotesque mirror of the relationship between Stanley and Livingstone. Livingstone had offered Stanley moral validation, the approval of a good man. Leopold offered Stanley social validation, the approval of a king. Stanley needed both, and the need made him blind to the difference between what each man represented. He married Alice Pike, the woman for whom the Lady Alice had been named, only to discover that she had married someone else during his absence. He then married Dorothy Tennant, a society painter who provided him with the domestic respectability he had always craved, and who, after his death, would attempt to destroy his private papers to prevent the truth about his origins from becoming public. The marriage was, by all accounts, functional, but not intimate. Stanley had spent too many years behind the mask to remove it in the privacy of his own home. Dorothy loved a character. The person beneath the character remained, as he had always been, unreachable. In 1895, Stanley was elected to the British Parliament as a Liberal Unionist member for Lambeth North. The Welsh workhouse boy sat in the House of Commons, surrounded by the sons of privilege whose approval he had spent his life pursuing, and said almost nothing of consequence. He served for 5 years. His parliamentary career produced no legislation, no memorable speeches, no discernible impact on public policy. The silence that had characterized his response to the Congo extended to every other subject. The man who had crossed Africa, navigated the Congo, and produced some of the most vivid exploration writing of the 19th century, sat in Parliament like a monument to his own past, imposing, immovable, and increasingly irrelevant. His health, which had been undermined by decades of tropical disease, began its final decline in the late 1890s. The malaria that had attacked him more than 20 times during his African expeditions had left permanent damage to his liver and kidneys. The dysentery had scarred his intestinal tract. The physical abuse of thousands of miles of forced marching, inadequate nutrition, and chronic dehydration had aged him beyond his years. By 1900, he was walking with a cane. By 1903, he was largely confined to his home. His mind remained sharp, but his body, the instrument that had carried him across a continent, was failing with the systematic thoroughness of a machine whose components had been run past their tolerances for too long. He was knighted in 1899, Sir Henry Morton Stanley, GCB, and the honor that would have meant everything to him 20 years earlier arrived too late to provide more than a bitter satisfaction. The establishment that had mocked him, questioned his credentials, and investigated his origins had finally accepted him. But the acceptance came with the implicit acknowledgement that he was no longer a threat. A sick old man in a London townhouse, attended by a wife who managed his legacy with the vigilance of a security detail, receiving visitors who came to pay respects to a legend. This was not the Stanley who had terrified the geographical establishment. This was a Stanley who could be safely honored because he could no longer disturb anyone's complacency. He died on May 10, 1904, at the age of 63. His last recorded words were, 4 o'clock, how strange. So that is the time. Strange. Enough. The words are as enigmatic as anything he ever said, a final utterance that seems to reach for meaning and then, characteristically, withdraw behind a wall of ambiguity. Dorothy requested that he be buried in Westminster Abbey beside Livingstone. The request was denied. The Dean of Westminster judged that Stanley's methods in Africa, the fighting, the forced treaties, the association with Leopold, made him unsuitable for interment alongside the saintly missionary. Stanley was buried instead at Purbright, in Surrey, beneath a granite block inscribed with a single word, Africa. The denial of Westminster Abbey was, in its way, the final expression of the distinction that Victorian England insisted upon drawing between Livingstone and Stanley, a distinction between the missionary and the mercenary, the saint and the soldier, the man who walked through Africa with a Bible, and the man who walked through it with a rifle. The distinction was real, but it was also a convenience. It allowed England to celebrate Livingstone's idealism without examining the uses to which that idealism was put, and to condemn Stanley's methods without acknowledging that those methods were the logical extension of the project Livingstone had initiated. The two men were not opposites. They were sequential. Livingstone opened the door. Stanley walked through it, and what came through the door after Stanley was something neither man had intended, but both had made possible. The exposure of Leopold's Congo came not from Stanley, not from the British government, and not from the missionary societies that had used Livingstone's name to justify their presence in Africa. It came from individuals whose moral courage operated outside the institutional frameworks that had failed so comprehensively to prevent the catastrophe. The first sustained exposure came from George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist, historian, and Civil War veteran who visited the Congo in 1890 and wrote an open letter to Leopold that cataloged the abuses with a specificity that could not be ignored. Williams described the forced labor, the hostage-taking, the destruction of villages, and the systematic deception of African chiefs with a clarity that drew directly on his own experience as a black man in a country built on slavery. He understood in ways that white observers often did not, the mechanisms by which a system of exploitation could be maintained through a combination of violence and legal fiction. His letter was dismissed by Leopold's allies as the work of an aggrieved troublemaker. Williams died the following year, at the age of 41, before his campaign could gain momentum. But the evidence continued to accumulate. Edmund Dean Morrell, a British shipping clerk who noticed that the ships returning from the Congo carried vast quantities of rubber and ivory, while the ships going out carried only guns, ammunition, and chains, began investigating the discrepancy and discovered the system of forced labor that produced it. Morrell became the most effective anti-Congo campaigner in Europe, founding the Congo Reform Association in 1904 and publishing exposé after exposé that detailed the atrocities with a relentlessness that made him the most hated man in Leopold's court and the most admired in the circles of humanitarian reform. Roger Casement, the British consul in the Congo, conducted an official investigation in 1903 that produced a report of such devastating specificity, naming villages, counting amputees, interviewing survivors, that the British government was forced to acknowledge what it had spent 2 decades ignoring. The testimonies that Casement collected were the testimonies that Livingstone had spent his life trying to gather, evidence of human suffering documented with sufficient precision to compel action. The difference was that Livingstone had been documenting the Arab slave trade, and Casement was documenting the European system that had replaced it. The tools were the same: journal entries, witness statements, the careful accumulation of irrefutable detail. The perpetrators had changed. The language of justification had not. Leopold resisted the pressure for as long as he could, deploying a public relations apparatus of remarkable sophistication. He funded counter-investigations, bribed journalists, and employed lobbyists in every European capital. He pointed to the hospitals and schools his administration had built, and they were real, though they served only a fraction of the population and existed primarily as props for the humanitarian narrative that justified the entire enterprise. He invoked Livingstone. He invoked the suppression of the slave trade. He invoked the civilizing mission. The vocabulary that Livingstone had created, polished by decades of missionary rhetoric and validated by the moral authority of a man buried in Westminster Abbey, proved remarkably resistant to the evidence that it had been repurposed to justify atrocity. But the evidence was too voluminous and too specific to be suppressed indefinitely. Photographs circulated. Images of men, women, and children holding up the stumps of their severed hands, staring into the camera with expressions that ranged from shock to resignation to a blankness that was worse than either. These photographs became the visual signature of the Congo atrocities, reproduced in newspapers and pamphlets across Europe and America, and they did what Livingstone's word pictures of the slave trade had done a generation earlier. They made the suffering impossible to aestheticize, impossible to abstract, impossible to ignore. A severed hand is not a policy debate. It is a fact of flesh and bone that resists every attempt to convert it into an argument about the complexities of colonial governance. In 1908, under pressure that had become politically unbearable, Leopold was forced to cede the Congo Free State to the Belgian government. The transfer was not an act of justice, it was a transaction. Leopold received 50 million francs in compensation, payment for the loss of his private estate, as if the territory and the millions of people who lived in it were items on a balance sheet. The Belgian government renamed the territory the Belgian Congo and implemented reforms that ameliorated the worst abuses without addressing the fundamental structure of extraction that Leopold had established. The forced labor system was modified, but not abolished. The rubber quotas were reduced, but not eliminated. The severed hands stopped, but the exploitation continued in forms that were less photogenic and therefore less susceptible to international outrage. Leopold died in 1909, 1 year after losing the Congo. He was 74. He had spent the final years of his life attempting to destroy the documentary evidence of what had been done in his name, ordering the burning of the Congo Free State archives, a bonfire that consumed years of records and that was, in its way, the final act of the system he had created. The destruction of evidence was as systematic as the destruction of people had been. Both served the same purpose: the erasure of accountability. Leopold was buried with the honors due a king. No criminal charges were ever filed. No reparations were ever paid. The 10 million dead remained uncounted, unnamed, and, for decades, largely unremembered. The story of David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley is not, in the end, a story about Africa. It is a story about the distance between words and deeds, between the language of salvation and the practice of destruction, between what men believe they are doing and what they actually do. Livingstone believed he was opening Africa to Christianity, commerce, and civilization. He was opening it to conquest. Stanley believed he was completing Livingstone's work. He was building the machinery of extraction. Leopold believed, or claimed to believe, that he was bringing light to the darkness. He was creating one of the darkest chapters in the history of human cruelty. Each man used the same vocabulary, each man invoked the same justifications, and each man left behind a legacy that contained, in equal and inseparable measure, genuine achievement and genuine catastrophe. Livingstone did more than any single individual to end the East African slave trade. The evidence he accumulated, the public attention he generated, and the moral pressure his life and death created were instrumental in the closure of the Zanzibar slave market and the suppression of the slave routes he had documented. This was real. It saved real lives. It mattered. But the same missionary, the same man who wept over the bodies at Nyangwe and who walked until his body failed because he could not bear the existence of a trade that treated human beings as cargo, that man also created the moral framework that Leopold used to justify a system of forced labor that killed 10 million people. Livingstone's 3 C's, Christianity, commerce, and civilization, were weapons that could be wielded by anyone for any purpose, once the man who coined them was no longer alive to control their use. He bequeathed to Africa a vocabulary of liberation that became a vocabulary of enslavement, and he was not alive to see the transformation or to protest it. Stanley's legacy is darker and more direct, but it is also more complex than the simple narrative of villain allows. The man who built Leopold's roads and established Leopold stations was also the man who crossed Africa, mapped the Congo, and produced a body of geographical knowledge that transformed European understanding of the continent. He was a man of extraordinary capability and extraordinary limitation, capable of enduring hardships that would have destroyed most men, incapable of examining the moral implications of his own endurance. The workhouse had given him the will to survive anything. It had not given him the tools to question whether survival, by itself, justified the cost of what was destroyed in its pursuit. Stanley spent his life building an identity strong enough to contain the abandoned child he had been. He succeeded. The identity was impregnable, but the cost of maintaining it, the silence about the Congo, the complicity with Leopold, the refusal to examine what his achievements had produced, was paid not by Stanley, but by the millions of people who lived in the territory he had opened. And Chuma and Susi, the men who carried Livingstone's body 1,000 miles, who buried his heart beneath an African tree, whose loyalty and competence made possible both the documentation of the slave trade and the preservation of the journals that would help end it. They returned to their lives in East Africa and vanished from the historical record with a completeness that tells its own story about whose suffering counts and whose does not. Chuma died in 1882, barely a decade after the journey that should have made him famous. Susi lived until 1891. Neither man received any lasting recognition from the nation that buried Livingstone in Westminster Abbey. Their names appear in the footnotes of Livingstone's biographies, in the margins of the story they helped create, acknowledged but never centered, present but never primary. The 1,000-mile journey they undertook, carrying a dead man through floods and fevers and hostile territory, preserving the documents that would change the course of history, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of devotion in the record of human exploration. It was performed by men whose full names many historians still cannot agree upon. The Congo River still flows. 2,700 miles from its source in the highlands of Zambia to its mouth at the Atlantic, carrying more water than any river on Earth except the Amazon, draining a basin that encompasses 9 countries and some of the most biologically diverse forest on the planet. The cataracts that nearly killed Stanley still thunder through their gorges. The forest that pressed against his flotilla still stands, diminished by logging and agriculture, but still vast, still dense, still producing the layered sound of billions of organisms living and dying in a cycle that predates human presence on the continent by millions of years. Victoria Falls still roars, the spray still rises, the rainbow still hangs in the mist above the gorge. The Makololo name, Mosi Oatunya, the smoke that thunders, has been restored to official use alongside the name Livingstone imposed, a small correction in a ledger of impositions that will never be fully balanced. In Chitambo, near the southern shore of Lake Bangweulu, a concrete pillar marks the spot where Livingstone died. The Ampundu tree beneath which Chuma and Susie buried his heart was cut down by a subsequent European visitor who wanted it as a relic, a final posthumous act of extraction that Livingstone himself might have found grimly appropriate. A replacement monument was erected. It stands in a clearing that is quiet in the morning, surrounded by the same Mayambo woodland that Livingstone walked through in his final months, and it bears an inscription that identifies the site with the restrained precision of a plaque in a museum. It does not mention Chuma. It does not mention Susie. It does not mention the 9 months they spent carrying a dead man home. In Denbigh, Wales, a small museum occupies a building near the site of the workhouse where John Rowland spent 9 years of his childhood. The workhouse itself was demolished long ago, but the museum preserves what it can: documents, photographs, a few personal effects, and tells the story of the boy who became Henry Morton Stanley with a sympathy that acknowledges both the achievement and the cost. Visitors are few. The museum is not on any major tourist route. The story it tells is not the story most people come to Wales to hear. In Westminster Abbey, Livingstone's grave lies in the center of the nave, surrounded by the tombs of kings and queens, poets and generals, the accumulated dead of a civilization that believed itself to be the measure of all others. The inscription on the black marble slab records his dates, his achievements, and the manner of his death. It includes a passage from his own writings, words that he wrote near the end of his life, when the fever was constant and the blood was flowing, and the source of the Nile was no closer than it had been when he started. All I can add in my solitude is, may heaven's rich blessing come down on everyone, American, English, or Turk, who will help to heal this open sore of the world. The open sore he was describing was the slave trade. The words were inscribed on his tomb as a testament to his compassion and his moral vision. They are beautiful words. They are sincere words. And they carry within them, like a seed inside a fruit, the assumption that animated Livingstone's entire life, and that would prove, in the century that followed his death, to be the most dangerous idea in the history of the African continent. The assumption that Africa was a wound and that Europe was the physician. The physician came. The physician built roads and railways, schools and hospitals, churches and trading posts. The physician mapped the rivers, cataloged the species, translated the languages, and documented the cultures with the meticulous attention of a researcher studying a specimen. The physician also extracted the rubber, the ivory, the copper, the diamonds, the cobalt, the coltan, and the oil. The physician also drew borders that divided peoples who had been united and united peoples who had been divided. The physician also imposed systems of governance that concentrated power in the hands of the few and denied it to the many. The physician also left, eventually, when the cost of maintaining the practice exceeded the revenue it generated, and the patient was left with the roads and the railways and the borders and the systems of governance and the open sore, which had not healed but had merely changed its shape. David Livingstone walked into Africa believing he could heal it. Henry Morton Stanley walked into Africa believing he could map it. Leopold II looked at Africa from his palace in Brussels and believed he could own it. Each man was wrong, but each man's wrongness took a different form and produced different consequences. And the consequences are still unfolding in the streets of Kinshasa and the mines of Katanga and the forests of the Ituri and the markets of Zanzibar, where the Anglican cathedral that replaced the slave market still stands, its altar on the spot where the whipping post once stood, a monument to the belief that one kind of suffering can be redeemed by the construction of a building on top of it. The 4 most famous words in the history of exploration, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, were spoken by a man who was performing a role, to a man who had forgotten how to perform anything in a place that neither of them understood as well as they believed, on a continent that would bear the consequences of their meeting for generations after both of them were dust. The words are funny. They are absurd. They are the most British sentence ever spoken by a Welshman pretending to be an American. And beneath their surface, like the current beneath the surface of the Congo, they carry the whole weight of this story: the loneliness, the ambition, the courage, the cruelty, the love that could not be expressed and the destruction that could not be prevented, the workhouse and the mill, the slave market and the cathedral, the map and the territory, the word and the deed, the open sore and the hand that reached out to heal it, and in healing opened it wider than before. Livingstone's heart is still buried in Africa. His bones lie in Westminster Abbey. The division seems fitting for a man who was never whole in either place, who gave his heart to a continent he could not save, and his body to a nation that used his memory to justify what he had spent his life opposing. Stanley's grave in Surrey bears the single word Africa, as if the continent were a summary of the man, or the man a summary of the continent, or both were summaries of something larger that neither words nor monuments nor the accumulated weight of 150 years of scholarship has been able to fully express. The river flows on. The falls thunder. The forest breathes. And the story, the real story, the one beneath the one we tell ourselves, remains, as it has always been, an open sore of the world.